Hello and welcome to Eastern Roman History. Today I am joined by Dr Byron Waldron of the University of Sydney, and we shall be going through the emperors of the 3rd century crisis. Hello Byron.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and area of study?
I study, the 3rd century and the Tetrarchic period. I look at political culture and dynastic politics, military rebellion, things like that. Not sure what else to say. I have a book coming out later this year on dynastic politics in the age of Diocletian. And some of my videos, I've collaborated with History Marche on Aurelian and the Battle of Satala as well.
And now you're here.
Yes.
Right. So, the crisis of the 3rd century, I find it a very fascinating part of Roman history. When it begins with the reign of Alexander Severus, who's almost the prelude, like the calm before the storm, so to speak, for the period. The entire empire changes in character, in how it operates, and in many other areas. And it's through this process of crisis and the Roman response to it that the empire of Augustus and Hadrian and people like that ceases to be, and the empire of Diocletian, Constantine, Theodosius and people like that comes into being and sets up how the empire operates for the next 400 or so years. Until Justinian and Heraclius and emperors such as them.
Yeah, and it's a frustratingly poorly recorded period, really, because, as you say, this is really when the empire is, through trial by fire, is being moulded into the later Roman Empire. We sort of run out of good sources around the year 238, when Herodian's history ceases.
Yeah.
And we've just got a bunch of fragments and summary histories and various bits of invective and panegyric, in the case of the Tetrarchs. And not much, really, before Diocletian is emperor. That sort of, especially those 50 years in the middle, are very badly attested, which is a shame because presumably Diocletian doesn't do everything from scratch. Yeah. Presumably this is a long process. And we get some hints of that, and I guess we'll discuss them when we get to certain emperors, but... It requires a lot of detective work, this period.
Yeah, it's less of a case of there aren't any sources, but there's so many there's lots of little ones scattered all over the place through... I mean, one of the major sources for the period comes from the 12th century, a guy called John Zanarus, who provides lots of information that hasn't survived, but he epitomized the sources he had for the period. And we can kind of use those to piece together things that are sources closer to the time, like the Historia Augusta or Eutropius or Lactantius or people like that, don't tell us. It's it's a very patchwork tapestry of history for this period.
Oh, definitely. I mean, Zonorus seems to be recording a combination of various Greek and Latin historical traditions, Latin traditions that have been presumably translated into Greek. Much of it is lost in its original form, because we know that there were very detailed histories by the likes of Dexippus and Eunapius, who Zosimus is abbreviating.
Yeah.
And if we had those original sources, we'd be much better off. But yes, as it happens, one of our most important sources is a 12th century Byzantine epitomator, Zonorus. We're also very reliant on Aurelius Victor and Eutropius, these 4th century writers of summary histories, who are using a source now referred to as the Kaisergeschichte, the imperial history, that also appears to be what Ammianus was using to a degree before he gets a little more detailed with his coverage of the Constantinian period.
Yeah. Yeah,
and we get various fragments of these earlier sources, but yes, there's a lot of summary histories and fragments that we have to use,
and
as well as
polemic
Exactly. Yes, Lactantius is one of the most important sources that we sort of have to use. he, he he does not like Diocletian, and so that colours our view of things as well.
Lactantius is quite interesting because he provides a lot of information, like the expansion of the bureaucracy and the armies under Diocletian. But it's written in such a way to leave a horrible taste in your mouth. It's like they only expanded the armies because they were jealous of each other, and the administration became so bloated that the poor provincials were crushed under its weight. So you have to try and go, the administration was expanded, and that's the truth, and then the other facets of that truth are kind of lost in the polemic. And also, like, you have other interesting sources like the Historia of Augusta, which I think its information best described as lies, damned lies, and the truth.
Possibly with parody involved.
Yeah,
Lactantius, exactly. You if we took him at his word, you'd have to believe that Diocletian more than quadrupled the size of Rome's legions. Well, the manpower of Rome's legions, which generally isn't taken that seriously, but I guess we can take from that an expansion in the size of the army. And
you have later sources to help inform, John
Lidus?
the Lydian, who tells us exactly how many troops Diocletian had. At what time, we don't know, but it's useful in and of itself because it's so precise that you can almost take it for granted that it's true. The trouble is, when was that true?
Yes, it would be strangely precise if it wasn't true. Yes.
Yeah.
But yes, it's a shame that we don't know when in Diocletian's fairly long reign that is actually flying.
Shall we talk about Alexander Severus?
Sure. Yes.
I actually quite like Alexander Severus. I think his reign reminds me quite a bit of Antoninus Pius in that for 13 years of it, it's very peaceful. There's not that much external conflict at all, really. There are some internal issues between the Praetorian Guard and also the domineering character of his mother, Julia Mamaea, which causes problems. I remember Herodian talks about an instance where Alexander tried to marry someone and then his mother intervened, and it was a very messy situation. But on the whole, he has a fairly successful reign. You have people like Ulpian in charge and passing reforms, and a fairly stable empire, especially after the chaos of Elagabalus' reign, his half-brother cousin.
Yeah.
And also the civil war of Maximinus and bloody reign of Caracalla. So you've had all of these very colourful emperors, and then Severus is a nice calm period where things are allowed to an element of normalcy is allowed to return. And then things go horribly wrong in his last year as emperor when the Sassanid Persians start invading. He has a not very successful campaign against them. He fends them off, but the campaign itself was quite poorly organised, and quite a lot of Roman troops died during it. He had pulled legions from the western front along the Rhine and Danube, and by doing so, they had been attacked by Germanic tribes, and when he returned to deal with the tribes, he bought them off, which infuriated his soldiers, and they eventually murder him.
Yes. He was a bit unlucky, I think, yes. How do you think you would rate him?
His final year definitely is just such a disaster. It is perhaps also he hasn't managed to escape the control of his mum. Perhaps at first is a useful thing, because he's a young teenager when he becomes emperor.
Yes.
As he's growing up, you need the informed hand of Julia Maesa and Julia Mamaea, his grandmother and mother, to take care of things. And also you have people like Ulpian, who are Praetorian prefect. But when he became a man, he never got rid of Mamaea, who her usefulness had come, in a sense, now that wars were starting to spring up and he needed to be on campaign. You needed a man in charge, and a mama's boy, so to speak, was not really what was needed, and he suffered for it. But the 13 years that he was in charge as emperor were very good, on the whole. So I think I'm inclined to put him in the decent category.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'm leaning mediocre.
Okay.
Certainly he looks... I think one of the reasons why I think I'm feeling a bit cautious about him is he looks good next to what came before and what came after.
I think that's the other thing, that because you have all of these not very pleasant people before, and also all of the chaos that happens after his death, he does stand out a little bit as a kind of beacon of stability between the Severan and 3rd century crisis. So.
He's clearly providing more stability than Elagabalus or Caracalla or Maximinus could provide. The problem for me, I think, is... And yes, he does have a longish reign, which I think speaks well of him. I mean, that is not always
a good sign with people like...
Yeah, I mean, yes, and Commodus had a fairly long reign as well. I find some of the issues hard to get away from, because I think to a degree he is exaggerated in the literary traditions as this... the Historia Augusta, for example, treats him as being this very good emperor, but he looks good, I think, again, because of where he is placed in this timeline of emperors. And I think he is a better emperor than Elagabalus, certainly, but it's not clear what really he did beyond providing stability, because, yes, he's got this mother, Julia Mamaea, who's very controlling, and quite crucially for his downfall, Herodian, our contemporary source, makes clear that Alexander is a thrifty emperor, that he doesn't pay people, he doesn't give enough rewards, enough donatives. And Herodian blames that on Julia Mamaea, that if Julia Mamaea wasn't there, Alexander might be a more generous emperor. And as you say, it therefore seems that Alexander, to his detriment, never really succeeds in getting out from under his mother. I think Herodian also links that to what happens in the Persian War. I mean, I think to a degree, the Romans clearly weren't expecting the Sasanians to so quickly go on the offensive against them, because they'd only just taken power from the Parthians.
And be the threat that they were, in the same sense that the Parthians had really declined into almost ineptitude, and the Sassanids could genuinely take territory from the Romans and keep it, kind of threat.
Yes, I mean, the Parthians had become a punching bag for the Romans, really. Severus and Caracalla Severus was a good emperor, but they could also make themselves look better by starting wars with the Parthians, because the Parthians didn't really have it together by that point in time. And you can kind of see that in the fact that Ardashir, the founder of the Sasanian Empire, since I think 206 or something, had been slowly building up his own autonomy within the empire, in a way that the Parthians seem to have been underestimating. But eventually, the sort of a power within a power.
Yeah, he managed to do Cyrus the Great.
Yes, yeah, and suddenly the Sasanians are this enemy that are much stronger than the Parthians were. They're much more determined, they're more centralized, not as centralized as they'll later become in the 6th century, but still, compared to the very decentralized Parthians, a pretty formidable enemy. So I guess I can't blame Alexander too much for not really knowing fully what he was getting into when he went up against the Persians, but I think Herodian does say that so he organized that whole 3-pronged invasion of the Persian Empire, and he was meant to be leading that central prong into the Euphrates Valley, and there was going to be a southern army hitting the Euphrates, but from further south. And then there was another army coming up through Armenia and was ravaging Media Atropatene.
Yeah.
the three prongs did not coordinate well. The southern prong got wiped out. It just got ambushed and annihilated.
Yeah.
Yes. The northern wing apparently did fairly well. Was an intimidating force that sort of ravaged its way through Persian territory. But then when they weren't getting the support they needed, they had to return and had to cross back during the winter and suffered from the cold and disease. And so they lost a lot of men anyway because they weren't well supported. And the crucial factor here seems to be that the central prong under Alexander hung around in Antioch for much too long. And Herodian blames that again on Julia Mamaea. Well, in Herodian's view, being overprotective of her son and not wanting him to invade Persian territory. So if we take that seriously, and there is a degree to which empresses can be unfairly, have too much blamed on them personally, but if we take that seriously, I mean, whether we blame it on her or on him, he badly mishandled that war, it seems. I guess to his credit, he did pay off the Germans and therefore end the war in a cost-efficient way after a disastrous Persian war, but that just upset the soldiers who wanted they wanted revenge because a lot of these soldiers were from Gaul and Pannonia and they'd left their homes behind, which had been ravaged by Alemanni. And so I guess I have a hard time finding enough good in him beyond the fact that he was better than his successor and predecessor. And I'm not how much to credit him when he comes to power as a teenager.
I think I'll put him in mediocre.
All right.
I think you've made some good points. It could change depending on his successors, however, since they're interesting bunch. The next guy is Maximinus I. So he is the man that kills Severus and the rest of Alexander's family and seizes power with his son, also called Maximinus. And they rule for 3 years?
Yes.
He is a rather successful general. He successfully campaigns against the Germanic tribes. I think there was some archaeological evidence of a big battle between Romans and Germanic.
In Hanover, I think.
So maybe Maximinus did do what Alexander didn't and actually have a punitive expedition against the Germanic tribes. But I think a good general is all that Maximinus was, because he never managed to get the Senate on his side, or the traditional pillars of power, which eventually led to his downfall, because you have the rebellions of the two Gordians and also Pupienus and Balbinus all being proclaimed emperor against Maximinus, so you have a civil war to get rid of him, and to deal with that civil war, his troops get bogged down with a siege at Aquileia, and they get sick to death of him, and they decide to murder him instead, and his son. I'm not sure where to rank him, though.
Yeah, because he's an interesting contrast between... he shines out as a military emperor, I think, but yes, he falls badly short in the other categories.
There's some good descriptions of him being a colossus. There's a story of Septimius Severus. He asks him to join his armies, and he says he can if he can keep up with his horse, and he does. So you get this good impression of this very strong and athletic emperor. A good soldier is not necessarily a good emperor. So he's almost the complete opposite to Alexander, who was potentially a decent emperor, but was a bit of a rubbish military commander. And then Maximinus is a good commander, but he doesn't know the first thing about ruling an empire. Or at least having a good relationship with the Senate, which is often the measure of how good an emperor is to the Romans, which leads to his downfall. Admittedly, it's not quite at first that the Senate has to send 4 people at him, and none of them actually manage to get rid of him. It's the catalyst to his own demise. I
think I'm ranking him as a poor emperor.
Yeah?
I think to a degree there is a sense in which there's reason to be a bit cautious with the sources, just because he is he's the second ever equestrian to become emperor after Macrianus. And he's the first ever, as Eutropius specifies this, he's the first to be a career officer, to come from fairly humble background and then to somehow make it to the emperorship. And so the senatorial authors and the aristocratic authors are kind of going to have it in for him. But, I mean, some more positives on him. He was a successful military emperor, it seems. One fascinating thing about him is he does seem to have actually fought in or near to the front lines in a way that seems to be genuine, because Herodian specifically brings this up a few times, and yet Herodian does not like Maximinus and has no reason to make this up. It sort of goes to, it really ties into the Roman virtue of virtus, manly sort of valor. It seems, and I guess it's because this guy is a career officer, that this is probably less of a weird thing in his mind. I mean, there seems to be a lot that Maximinus didn't understand about how emperors tended to act anyway. But I guess to his credit, he was there in the thick of it, apparently. And he does seem to have been a bit up against it with regard to the Senate, because we know that he faced various usurpers, or at the very least, suspected usurpers. There seems to be real usurpers, even before the whole year of the 6 emperors in 238, because we know that there was someone called Magnus who was planning a conspiracy and then got caught out for it, and he was a senator, and I think it was Quintillus maybe was the name of the other one, but he led the Moorish auxiliaries, and he was attempting something and then got caught. Yeah. It looks like even quite early on he was suffering a hostile Senate, but it also seems that he made no attempt to really rectify that.
Yeah.
Because
except through force.
Yes, I mean,
which in some respects it worked, because it did win him the credit of some people, like the governor of Africa, Capetianus?
Oh,
no,
Capellianus, yeah,
who dealt with the Gordians for him. He was loyal enough to Maximinus to not only uphold his cause and get rid of the Gordians, but also not then declare himself emperor as well. I mean, that's the other thing, with Alexander dead, Maximus has no legitimacy other than he holds the role. So
yeah,
he's in a very difficult spot, and he has also no way of linking himself to the previous dynasty, because they're all dead.
Yes.
Which he had some small part in doing, but I'm almost not surprised he had some plots and rebellions against him. The fact that there are so many so quickly, or especially in the year of the 6 emperors, which is really more the fault of the Senate, but he hasn't got any legitimacy and does nothing to try and get some. Other than
I guess
being a good soldier.
Exactly. I think he relies completely on his campaigns against Germans and Sarmatians, which is going to be good for the loyalty of the legions along the Rhine and the Danube. But I guess in one of the few times, I guess, in the 3rd century when this happens, the Senate actually does take matters into its own hands. And I guess they were sufficiently upset that they did, which does seem telling. I mean, as you say, he is the first post-Severian emperor.
I think it's also got quite as much of the social change which happens during the 3rd century, that the Senate is still able to exert some power over political makeup of the empire.
Yes.
Which by the end of the century, they're basically almost completely obsolete by that point.
Yes, they'll get their last sort of hurrah with Maxentius, but really that was after a long period of decline.
Yeah.
I think he had a lot going up against him, but also the sources do make fairly clear that he overtaxed the people of Italy, which at the very least, if you're not going to be friends with the Senate, you should try to be friends with the people of Rome. There were, meant to have been various executions. Apparently some were pretty unjust. He's described as someone who executed people to get their wealth, which is a bit of a trope, but 3 years is 3 years. Clearly something was going wrong.
Yeah.
Actually, David Potter points out that the Eastern governors and their legions switched their allegiance to the Gordians fairly quickly, which suggests that even in terms of provincial loyalty, he fell a bit short. that. And one thing David Potter points out is the legions in the Danube and Rhine areas were referred to as Maximiana, but we don't have that for the east. So we can see some level of perhaps favoritism for the northern frontier legions at the expense of the poor legions having to deal with the Persians in the east.
Yeah.
And we know that in 238, when Maximinus does get overthrown, the Persians are back on the offensive, because in that year, Nisibis and Carus both get sacked. Yeah. So things are turning a bit raw there, and it seems that Maximinus didn't do a particularly good job of winning their allegiance. So yeah, I'd say poor. I'm going poor emperor.
I think I'm inclined to agree. His military credentials prevent him from being further down, but his other policies and his whole situation, which he didn't manage to improve himself, because a better emperor would have been able to sort themselves out of that situation, or at least lasted a bit longer. So people like Probus or Gallienus in very shaky situations, managing to at least claw on to power for much longer periods. But Maximinus just never manages to do anything about it, and is almost, I wouldn't say the cause of his death, but he doesn't do all that much to stop it. Yeah, you would think, being the first of the post-Severan emperors, the first career officer emperor, he might have done more to ingratiate himself with the other demographics of his empire, and it sounds like he sort of just leaned too hard into the northern frontier and their support, and in the end they betrayed him anyway. So let's talk about Gordian I. I think Gordian is... Well, Gordian the First and Gordian the Second, we kind of have to talk about both of them, because they reigned exactly the same amount of time together. Yes.
22 days.
Yes, he's the shortest emperor on record, with a fairly secure amount of days they ruled. Quintillus will come to. But it doesn't go that well for Gordian. He's proclaimed emperor by the Senate, and he goes okay. And his son also becomes emperor, and he's put in charge of the army to deal with Capellianus, thank you. To defeat them. Gordian II is killed in battle against Capellianus, and his forces defeated, and then Gordian I, after hearing the news, commits suicide, which isn't all that good of a record, really. There's an element of valiance, and he had been quite a respectable official earlier in his life, because he was quite an old man when he became emperor, hence why Gordian II did the campaigning.
I think he was octogenarian, wasn't he? He was in his 80s.
Yeah, I think he also wrote a history of Antoninus Pius or something like that.
Oh!
I think it might be in the Historia Augusta, so it's probably complete nonsense. But
right.
I think he's poor and incompetent, Gordian. I don't think he's bad, because he's not necessarily... He didn't make poor decisions or anything like that. It's just Gordian II, who I'm also putting in incompetent, was outgeneraled by Capellianus, and they both ended up dead because of it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think they're both poor. I mean, I fundamentally don't understand why they did what they did, because yes, they had prestige on their side, with Gordian being the proconsul of Africa. It does. I mean, there's a whole question of whether they took the initiative or not, but the problem is the sources have this trope of recusatio, where the emperor is offered the emperorship and then the soldiers or the people have to kind of force it on them.
Yeah.
And we get in the accounts for Gordian, that is a trope, and so it may well be the case that Gordian did take the initiative, thinking he could lead the senatorial charge against Maximinus. My problem with this is, I mean, yes, it worked in the end for the Senate, not for Gordian, but he doesn't have a legion under his command. The proconsul of Africa does not have significant military forces. He's there to, he's in charge of the province that has the grain supply to Africa, to the city of Rome, which is going to be on the side of Africa anyway if the Senate joins him, and they did. So it's not like he can wield the grain supply as a weapon.
I think, I may be wrong, but in the only two public provinces with legions in them was Macedonia and Africa.
By this time, the legion that was in Africa was now in the equestrian province of Numidia, and that's where Gallienus comes in. And so he's starting this usurpation without having the Third Augustan Legion of Numidia on his side and their governor Gallienus. And so that's why we have Gordian II taking them on outside of Carthage, or in the vicinity of Carthage, with his sort of peasant army.
Yeah, his levy.
Yeah, and quite naturally getting badly defeated. So I have trouble sympathizing with an effort that doesn't at the outset involve at least one legion.
Yeah. It almost gives credence to the fact that he was thrust into the emperorship, because you'd have to be mad to think that your levies would be able to defeat a Roman legion, not just auxiliary troops.
Yeah, maybe that is the case. Maybe he wasn't unwilling.
I mean, maybe Gordian II was perhaps a bit jingoist. I don't know, sometimes tropes are accurate as well.
I think Gordian II, I mean, it's hard to not view Gordian II as a poor emperor, because he's the one who went out there and actually took the legion on in a battle, whereas he could have remained behind the walls of Carthage. I guess to Gordian I's credit, he at the very least has his whole seizure of power with regard to Rome is kind of cool, because he does send like that private dispatch to the Senate of Rome, and then they quickly organize with orders to kill the Praetorian prefect and the deputy of the urban prefect, because they understood them to be Maximinus loyalists. And I think the soldiers showed up during the early morning of the Praetorian prefect would start having his daily meetings at 4 a.m. or something. The soldiers showed up. Well, not the soldiers, the senators showed up as if to have a meeting and then cut him down. And so I guess I have to give him credit for kind of a cinematic and well-executed takeover of the city.
Yeah.
I suppose I could see him as maybe mediocre if it was really thrust upon him, but Gordian II, no matter what, I view as poor at this point.
Yeah. I just think 20 days is a bad record even for Roman emperors, where you can have emperors one after the other. But yeah.
Yeah, pretty bad.
I'm incompetent in the end. But I think they're slightly better than the people that came after them, with Pupienus and Balbinus. They're proclaimed emperor by the Senate after the Gordians are dead, and then they have to deal with Maximinus, who they completely fail to do. Maximinus is basically taken out by his own troops, and Pupienus and Balbinus have very little to do with it. They don't get on with each other, and their jealousies become such that the Praetorian Guard decide just to murder them and proclaim Gordian III, who is the grandson of Gordian I, as emperor instead.
This might be because I'm misremembering, but I'm inclined to maybe view Pupienus as
slightly better.
Okay. Well, okay, so from what I remember is that he does have a respectable career as a military officer, as a general, before he becomes emperor. And then once he is emperor, he does seem to be given the military side of things.
And Balbinus stays in Rome.
Yes, and so I think Pupienus he goes up to Ravenna, oversee the war against Maximinus. I mean, it gets decided at Aquileia, further to the northeast, and that's where that Tullius Monophilus and I think maybe another commander are leading the garrison, and they basically take everything into the city. They do a scorched earth policy. They take all their food and cattle into the city and hold out against Maximinus, and Maximinus angrily commits to the siege, and then his soldiers turn against him. But I feel like I remember reading that maybe Pupienus did order that that there shouldn't be a battle, that the cities should be doing this policy. Avoid battle, keep to the cities, and eventually Maximinus will not be able to conduct the war. I think that might be to Pupienus' credit, but I'm not confident of that. He might be better than Balbinus in that sense.
Maybe incompetent.
Yeah. Maybe. No, I might have to take that back. I may have given him too much credit.
Back in the bad
Yeah.
pile he goes.
Yeah, it doesn't look like either of them contributed a great deal to the defeat of Maximinus, really.
I think it says something to their discredit that their biggest accomplishment is getting murdered for their infighting, despite the fact that Maximinus is still on the scene.
That is literally the most notable thing that happened with them. Yeah.
You really can't be the best ruler. That's your one-page summary of your reign.
Yes, I think the bad relations with Balbinus, where it was so bad within 3 months that they couldn't cooperate to deal with the Praetorians, that's pretty awful. To lose control of your imperial college that quickly, that's pretty bad. I know that Pupienus was considered to be overly severe, and so he was disliked not even by the Praetorians, not just by the Praetorians, but by the people
as well.
That's why Gordian III. Yeah, well, the Gordian III, when Pupienus and Balbinus were announced as the new emperors,
he is proclaimed Caesar as well.
Yes, and that was because the people basically revolted against it, which is it's sort of amazing that in only 22 days the Gordians, I think just shows the dynastic proclivities of the people of Rome, that in just 22 days the idea of making Gordian III Caesar to calm the populace, it's quite amazing that it got to that point so quickly.
I think also maybe it's because of the silence of the sources, but we shouldn't dismiss the former career of Gordian I. He was able to curry a lot of goodwill amongst the people during his career, and so when he eventually became emperor, and there's no other dynasty to look to, his line starts to become not only viable with Gordian III, but attractive as well.
That's a fair point, and I think it also reflects badly on Pupienus, because we know that he was a prestigious senator as well, and yet whereas Gordian could muster such loyalty to his family, despite being emperor himself for only 22 days, Balbinus was immediately rejected by the people, despite being a prestigious senator. He clearly did not appeal to the people at all. He was considered much too severe, and the Praetorians hated him and Balbinus. Partly, I think that isn't their fault, because it was actually another senator, Gallicanus. He and another senator, Maximinus, these two stabbed a bunch of Praetorians when they were trying to see what was going on regarding the accession of Balbinus and Pupienus. And so they entered the Senate House to see what was going on, and these two senators stabbed them. And that led to a big riot, and Gallicanus, this other senator, rallied the people and the senators against the Praetorians and started this street fight that where they ended up storming the Praetorian camp, failing to take it, and it just left a bad taste in everyone's mouth. I guess that, Balbinus, that isn't the fault of Balbinus or Pupienus that specifically happened. It sounds like that was other senators taking matters into their own hands because they despised the Praetorians, and viewed them as loyalists to Maximinus. But certainly Pupienus and Balbinus didn't achieve anything in their 3 months. They quickly turned against one another in such a short space of time. That's pretty bad.
Yeah.
At least Pupienus wasn't liked by the people. And Balbinus in particular, he did not do well in that final, the last hours, where Pupienus realized the danger they were in and was trying to get Balbinus to recall the German bodyguard so that they could protect them.
Yeah.
And Balbinus, not trusting him, believed that this was Pupienus's attempt to kill him and take over power using the German bodyguard. And so then, of course, they both get captured and brutally tortured and killed in the street by the Praetorians. And I think bad probably sums up both of them pretty well.
I wouldn't say awful, because they're not tyrants or anything like that, but...
Yeah, they're not malevolent,
just
very, very incompetent.
Bad is a very good way to describe them. So Gordian III, to me, is almost like a mini Alexander. His reign is fairly stable compared to the previous few years and the year of 6 emperors. You are starting to see the elements of what's going to happen in the next few decades. Barbarians are starting to penetrate into the frontiers. The political situation has managed to stabilize itself in the capital, but you are starting to get elements of rebellion. Historians have found potential usurpers during his reign, Some of the evidence isn't that good for it, so it's a bit of a question mark. But
I think there is a Sibelianus, maybe. I think there are coins attesting to someone called Sibelianus, but I think that's...
Yeah. The cracks are starting to appear. But with Timotheus, who was the Praetorian prefect who was in charge for much of Gordian's reign, you do have some return to stability. And for the 5 years that Gordian was emperor, which 5 years might not seem like a long time, but in the 3rd century, that's a very long time for an emperor. He is relatively successful. And also his campaign against Persia is a little bit better than Severus's. But like Severus, it's his downfall. For Alexander, it was the beginning of his downfall, and for Gordian, he died during the campaign. It's not exactly certain how he died. Some people say he was murdered by Philip. Some people say he died of an illness or on his way back from campaign, or murdered by... I think it was... One person says he was murdered by a secretary. There's a whole bunch of...
Yeah.
No one's sure how Gordian died, but he did. Seems to be the impression from the Roman historians. Presumably a few stories got back, which ended up in the histories. I think he was a mediocre emperor like Alexander Severus. It is quite interesting, his Antoniniani, which are silver coins which are worth 2 denarii, have very good strikes, minted a lot of coins, and very high quality ones.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that, so his coins were particularly high quality then.
In the strike, they are. I don't know about the metal content itself, but every Gordian coin Antoninianus I've seen has been fairly well made, and the coins in the 3rd century just go down the tube in terms of their quality in both metal content and the strike. So
yes,
it would be something I'd have to look into more. But just on face value observance, maybe there's something there.
Some sound economic management.
Yeah, maybe there's something to it. Yeah, there's also that aspect to Gordian, which I find interesting and makes him a bit more worthier than some of the other emperors we've discussed so far.
Yes, I mean it's an interesting aspect to consider, and I think he's better than anyone we've considered so far. As you say, so he ruled for the period a decent amount of time with no major issues until the very end.
Yeah.
So he was a teen when he came to power. So he was only 13 when he came to power. And I think as a teenage ruler, he did a better job than Alexander, I think. We know, for example, under Alexander, as you mentioned earlier, the Praetorians killing the Praetorian prefect Ulpia, this celebrated jurist. There's no incidents like that as far as we can tell. And he starts to put a lot of trust into Timotheus, his father-in-law / Praetorian prefect. We know that he had a very illustrious career as an equestrian, this guy, and was very talented. We know from an inscription that he had a long career as a logistical officer, logistical chief in the provinces. And so he was a very important person to have when you plan on going to war with Persia and ultimately invading Persia, which is what Gordian ultimately did. I think he was right to put trust in Timotheus. The Battle of Rosina, when Timotheus and Gordian defeated Shapur, is a particularly notable thing to consider because it's literally the only time that Shapur is reliably attested as losing a battle in the field. Actually, I mean, we don't have many details on these other campaigns, but as far as we can tell, against anyone, because Shapur was very busy also on his northern and eastern frontiers, from what we can tell from numismatics and inscriptions. But he was sort of this, for the period, an unstoppable king, and Timotheus and Gordian did win this victory and proceeded to retake, or either had already started retaking, Nisibis and Carus, these cities that had been captured by the Persians in 238 during the year of the Six Emperors. We also know, I mean, there's a good case to be made that they also timed it very well. On the one hand, you could say that, well, it took them kind of a long time to counterattack against the Persians, and maybe that's a bad look. But actually, when you look at what else is going on in the Persian Empire at that time, Shapur became the sole king of the empire in 241. And We know from a chronicle that claims that when Shapur became king, he basically had to rush to the Caspian Sea region, because the thing that I think can be underestimated is the Sasanians were still, they'd only been in power, it hadn't been 20 years yet.
Yeah.
And so with, the big daddy of the empire, Ardashir, suddenly dead, quite naturally certain vassals believed, just like the Parthians, that they could break free. And we know that Shapur had to travel to the Caspian Sea in the early 240s to deal with Hyrcanians and Gorganians and Daylamites, who had these, elite mercenary heavy infantry that the Persians used. They rebelled as well. And
I've heard the Sassanid Persian Empire described as a kind of federation. It's an anachronistic term, but it's not quite the unified empire the Roman Empire is, with like a center around the emperor and then all of the administrative provinces. You've got a far more decentralized, as you said earlier, and almost more autonomous state where the King of Kings really has to have his satraps on his side to get things done, and if he manages to annoy the Parthians, then a good portion of his empire is out of the works.
It's a feudal empire, and that's one of the reasons why Shapur can never really, he never really tries to either, but he's trying to conquer places in he wants to conquer Armenia and Upper Mesopotamia, but whenever he invades Syria or Asia Minor, he's conducting raids, and he's never trying to hold Antioch, because it seems that he physically can't with the armies that he has, because you can only get the cataphract, the sort of the Savaran knightly class of the Sasanians, to spend only so long far away from home in Roman Syria. And so he is more limited than the Romans in that sense. And he does go some way, compared with the Parthians, to centralizing power. We know that there were various vassal kings attested on coins that ceased to be attested by the 260s. And it looks as though he has implanted, he set up these governors who are members of the Sasanian royal family in places like Merv and Arachosia and Bactria. So he's putting the effort in to centralize his power, but it's certainly still a more feudal power and a more decentralized power than Rome is. I think, to the credit of Gordian and Timotheus, they presumably got word of what was going on in the Caspian Sea region and decided that was the time to make a move. And so probably Shapur had to put down these rebellions, return to Upper Mesopotamia, and then fight a battle on the back foot against Gordian and Timotheus. Ultimately went badly, because Timotheus then died and Gordian pushed into Lower Mesopotamia, and then Shapur defeated him at the Battle of Myzica, which is a battle that is strikingly absent from Latin sources, that they don't really, sort of just isn't mentioned, perhaps a little bit covered up.
It is the huge humiliation of the end result of the war, which is the death of Gordian and Praetorian Prefect, and also Philip the Arab having to pay this enormous 500,000. One could imagine it's just the huge humiliation of this campaign, despite having started so well. And also the Roman army was basically trapped by this battle.
Because Philip was basically having to pay a ransom. Yeah, it is. It's like it's the same situation as the Julian situation. It seems Philip was basically having to ransom his way out of Persian territory. The defeat itself does seem to have been a serious problem when it happened.
So where would you put Gordian?
I will also add, he does also seem to have handled, from what little we know of the northern frontier at this time, he seems to have handled that fairly well, because his reign is also when we first hear about the Goths. And we know that the Goths sacked a city on the Black Sea, I think it was Histria. The governor in the area, Monophilus, who was the same person who defended Aquileia against Maximinus, he paid off the Goths, but then defeated the Carpi, who thought they could do the same thing as the Goths. And so it seems, it's not a brilliant look, paying off the Goths, but it seems that they're sort of keeping things under control in that region in a way that later on it wouldn't be the case. I think, the whole death of Gordian issue is a fascinating one. I actually favour it's a matter of debate, of course, but I sort of favour the Byzantine version, which seems to stem from a Greek historical tradition in its original form, now lost, that he fell off his horse, busted his hip, and then the wound festered and he died on the march back. Which, and I kind of...
or something.
Yeah, and I favour that because it's so banal. I mean, relative to the other options. Because, so it sort of seems like, why would anyone really make that up? I mean, it fits with what we know. It's made clear that it happened during a battle. We can presume that's the Battle of Mysica, the defeat. Which I guess is a good look for Gordian, because it suggests that he was sort of in the thick of it, despite only being 19 by that point in time. But I mean, the idea that Philip, for example, killed Gordian, I find a difficult one to believe, because I think Philip, well, he set up, we know from Ammianus that he set up this large cenotaph for Gordian on the outskirts of Persian territory to honour Gordian, and he had his body transported back to Rome and he deified him. All things that would seem not politically astute when you're doing this while still leading the army that apparently killed him. I find it a strange disconnect. Again, Philip has he does have a bad time in the sources to a degree, because, again, he's an equestrian emperor. He took power in clearly circumstances where no one had a lot of reliable information going around about it. In enemy territory, and he naturally came under suspicion in a way that, when we stop and think about it, perhaps it's an unfair amount of suspicion. I suppose I'd consider him okay. Yeah, I think I'd put him a little bit ahead of mediocre, just because I think there are a few things he did distinctly better than Severus Alexander, while also, in the end, losing a battle that had a significant effect on the Roman Empire and his successor, Philip.
Philip the Arab is... I almost feel sorry for him, because it's in his reign that the features of the 3rd century really start to become evident, and also his reign is not all that successful.
Yes.
As I mentioned, he has the huge reparations to pay to the Sassanid Empire to buy his army out of Persia, which no one likes, and he also has to introduce very high taxes to pay for it all, which no one likes either. He does have the privilege of presiding over the 1000th anniversary of foundation of Rome, which he does successfully organise. That seems to be the only good thing that some of the sources have to say about him. But he has quite a lot of rebellions, major usurpations during his reign by Japatian and...
There's Pacatian as well.
Pacatianus, yeah. A third one as well.
Is there a Valens, like an early 3rd century Valens? Oh no, I'm thinking of Gallienus' reign, I think. There's a case to be made that he's fake, yes. I think it's sort of up in the air, but maybe.
But back to Philip, yes, he has a rather rough time, and also the frontiers are attacked all across the Rhine and Danube, and they start to buckle, which is partially why some of these usurpers rebel when they do. I think also the fact that Gordian is dead, and there's such confusion about the circumstances of his death, that you're, just like with Maximinus, you're naturally going to have people who are also going to try and seize the throne now that the legitimate emperor is dead, and the current emperor has no legitimacy whatsoever, other than he holds the office. To Philip's credit, though, he has a similar reign in length to Gordian, another 5-ish years. He manages to cling on to power for that time, but it just isn't enough. He's barely able to contain the attacks on the frontiers. He does manage to crush most of the usurpers, except for a certain Decius, and he is defeated in battle by Decius and killed, and then his son Philip II is murdered soon after. Interestingly, Philip, there's a tradition by later Christian writers.
Lactantius doesn't, but Eusebius does, actually.
That he was the first Christian emperor. I don't see how or why this would be. It's never mentioned by any other source which isn't Christian. It may just be like a legend or something. But it could be to do with the fact that his successor Decius was a persecutor And so Philip gets a nice write-up by Christian writers because he wasn't. One of his claims to fame is something he was almost certainly not.
It makes for an interesting historiographical situation that Philip wasn't well liked by the aristocratic authors because of the suspicions surrounding him coming to power and who he was, not being a senator. But certainly later Christian traditions like him because of this whole idea that he was a low-key Christian. Yeah, I think Eusebius does actually say something along those lines. I think he might frame it in a way that it isn't so blatant as later sort might say it. Like, I think maybe he suggests that Philip and his wife, Ottocilia, were particularly interested in Christian texts, and it might be framed in those terms, that this is a tradition that then got blown out of proportion after Eusebius. But Lactantius doesn't mention it. That's certainly true. Yeah, I think...
All other Christian writers during the 3rd century, like Cyprian, don't mention Philip's Christianity at all. So.
Yeah, that should be telling, yes.
Yeah, and I think Cyprian in his letters would be the first thing that he would write to whomever, that thank God we have a Christian emperor or something like that. You'd have the same kind of song and dance for Philip as you would for Constantine by Christians around him.
Yes, that's a very good point. Yeah, I mean, I can imagine a world in which maybe Philip was in contact with certain bishops maybe in the East simply because he was a native of Roman Arabia and which was it was a fairly Christian part of the Roman Empire, as was a lot of those Syrian and Eastern provinces. Likewise, we know that Zenobia was a patron of Paul of Samosata, the Bishop of Antioch. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Zenobia was a Christian. It just means that she was interested in various intellectual traditions, which fits with some of the hints we get about her. I think maybe it's the same case that Philip, because of where he was from, may have been interested enough to read Christian texts, but then it got exaggerated, in part, as you say, because his successor is a notorious persecutor. Yeah, I think Philip. So I'm kind of going. I agree with you. He had a tough time to deal. He had a lot of challenges to deal with. Yeah. I think it's hard to not view him as more than mediocre.
I would agree. I think he's mediocre as well. I think I'll stick his son there just because they come as a pair, like Gordian and Pupienus and Balbinus. But yeah, very difficult time. It is to his credit that he actually managed to get as well as he managed to.
Yeah, I think there's a few things we can list to his credit. I think one interesting thing he does do is he appoints his brother Priscus and his cousin Severianus as these sort of grand viceroys over the East and the Balkans, respectively. And so it seems to be his way of essentially setting up an imperial college without actually appointing them emperors. And that seems to give him some sort of control over those parts of the empire while he's based in Italy or wherever he happens to be at the time.
And with his son as Caesar, he's trying to establish his own dynasty. You start to see the formulation of what will eventually become... I'm not going to say that the Tetrarchy was always going to happen, but you see ideas being formulated by these emperors to deal with the problems that the Tetrarchy was designed to do.
Definitely.
All of the 3rd century emperors fail until Diocletian, but a lot of them, except for people like Aurelian and stuff like that, try to sort out this political mess that they are always on campaign, they have little to no legitimacy, they need to both have presences and people they can trust all over the empire, and also make sure they don't rebel and try and proclaim themselves emperor. And so Philip is the first emperor where you see these ideas starting to formulate. Exactly.
He is kind of been a trendsetter. He makes his son Caesar, and I think in 247, after 3 years of rule, Philip II does become an Augustus as well, in fact. Even though I think he's meant to be very young, he's still a teenager.
Yeah. I think he's 10 when he becomes emperor.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So he's sort of a future investment, I guess.
I think also he's Philip's man in Rome, so to speak. While Philip is going around and campaigning and doing all of this stuff, he has Philip in Rome to make sure that he has some sort of imperial body there. as Maximinus found out, just having someone in Rome is always beneficial.
Sure. One of the versions of his death, Philip II is in Rome when he gets killed in order to please Decius, So I guess that's it. He's sort of the representative in Rome. And then you have these other family members representing in the East and in the Balkans. He does also have, I think also to Philip's credit, he does have a notable victory over the Carpi. He's the first emperor to call himself Carpicus. We don't really know the details about it, but I guess significant enough, or maybe he was just looking for something to add to his credentials, but he is the first Carpicus.
Yeah.
Yes. Good dynastic propaganda to his credit. I mean, good hometown propaganda too. He made his hometown into the city of Philippopolis in Arabia. The construction stopped when he was killed, but I guess that's a notable point in his favor in terms of just building up a Philippian dynastic legend for himself. He could clearly throw a good party because he did run the anniversary celebrations were pretty notable. But so he did. Priscus, in particular, in the East, was meant to have made taxation overly severe. I don't know how much we can blame that on Philip or Priscus when they had to pay a tribute to the Persians.
Yeah.
The problem is it did then mean that Philip had to cease paying the Goths the stipend that they'd been receiving since the time of Gordian, which then from 248 onwards, we start to see the Gothic raids happening. And so, I don't know how much we should blame Philip for that because he's stuck between the Goths on the one hand and the Persian on the other, and he's got to kind of upset one of them to please the other, financially speaking. But there is also that increase in usurpations around this time with the figures that you mentioned, Picardianus and Jutapianus. And then he ultimately lost to Decius at the Battle of Verona. So I guess Hidioka probably sums him up.
Yeah. Philip starts debasing the Antoninianus coin, which ties into this huge financial crisis that he's in. It's
definitely, it would make sense.
I don't know what the percentage is. It's a little bit, but it's the start of the debasement around this time.
Yes.
And the debasement rapidly accelerates in these following decades until the Antonianus is basically a copper coin with like a silver wash on it. If you've ever seen a silver coin of Aurelian, it's hard to tell where the silver is.
I have one. Yes, exactly. It's questionable how silver they are, certainly.
Decius. He's a rather interesting emperor. As we've mentioned, he is a vicious persecutor of Christians, which means that they don't like him. It is worth seeing the Decian persecution in the context of his regeneration of the state by reviving Roman religion, championing Roman festivals and religious practices, rebuilding temples. He issues this edict of sacrifice, that everyone in the empire should sacrifice something for the welfare of the empire, and if you refuse, you will be punished, which is why a lot of these Christians ended up being executed or maimed and stuff like that. Although there are lots of them that did do it, which is the beginnings of the whole Donatist issue and so on. So there's that. I think also you have to understand why he's doing it. So Philip's reign, he's just managed to struggle through all these crises, but the crises immediately return and continue to get worse. The fortunes of state are also tied to the religious fortunes of the state, so getting the gods on their side will also get the fortunes of the empire to improve. So Decius he follows Philip's example and proclaims his son Herennius Etruscus as, I think he's Augustus.
I think so, yes.
And also he proclaims his son Hostilian as Caesar, and does what Philip does and sticks him in Rome. So there's always an imperial presence there. His downfall really comes not from a usurper, but from fighting the Goths at the Battle of Abritus. His son Herennius Etruscus is killed. There's actually quite a bit of detail about this moment. It takes place in this very boggy terrain, and the battle is a bit mixed. Herennius is killed. Decius finds out, and he just goes to pieces. It's a bit like Gallima in Battle of Ad Decimum in Justinian's African Wars. He just goes to pieces, and he decides to charge into the enemy and is killed, and his army retreats. It's not destroyed, because Trebonnianus Gallus is proclaimed emperor by them afterwards. But this leaves the empire in a bit of a fix.
Yeah, I mean, from what we know, Cneva, the Gothic leader, seems to have been actually quite a clever tactician. We know that at the Battle of Abritus, in Zosimus's account, there were 3 lines that he seems to have divided his Gothic army into 3 groups that essentially had enticed Decius's army into this bog, thinking he was winning, and then they got attacked on all sides, and Decius's body was never found because it basically sunk under the boggy water. Yeah, I mean, Decius, I consider him a bad emperor. I think I agree with you completely regarding the persecution issue, because I think the thing to keep in mind, not to excuse it, but to explain it, these 3rd century emperors who persecuted, it made sense in their worldview that if there is a significant proportion of the empire's inhabitants who is not sacrificing to the gods for the safety of the emperor and for the safety of the empire.
That's essentially, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, especially in a time of crisis, it's sort of no wonder that some of these emperors were on edge about the Christians.
Yeah.
Especially because, at least in the case of the Jews do the same thing, but the thing about them is they have antiquity on their side. They are a much older culture, and the Romans respected, even if begrudgingly at times, the antiquity of other cultures. And also the Jews weren't proselytizing. They don't have the Christianity does expect its adherents to spread the word, whereas Judaism is much more of it's a more
self-contained.
It's contained to Judea generally in this period, and that's generally how it functions. So I totally understand how it could get to the point that Decius is clearly unsettling for it was a bad thing for the Christians at the time, and it's unsettling to think about through a modern mindset. It does make sense how an edict for sacrifice could then lead to persecution.
I just had a thought,
Mm-hmm.
I think also the fact that some Christians are sacrificing, it makes sense to them that I could do this and it's no problem. I'm just asking God to help Decius rather than Jupiter or someone like that. And then you have these other Christians that aren't. So it's almost even more they're actively conspiring against the state.
Yeah, and we actually see that eventually when Galerius in 311 issues the Toleration Edict for Christians. He actually words it in a very similar way, where he sort of begrudgingly says in the edict, well, we can't stop you guys doing this, but at the very least, sacrifice to your God for the safety of the emperor.
Yeah.
And so there is this idea that this is something you can do. And so I guess that is going to cause aggravation. I mean, it's certainly a complicated issue because, of course, these Christians are being ordered to do rites that don't accord with Christian rites, and explicitly, they're expected to be sacrificing to the pantheon and that. But certainly it does create this disconnect where some Christians are nevertheless doing it. I mean, so he defeated Philip, albeit with a larger and better army, with all the Balkan soldiers at his back. He also did make good use of propaganda, because the Sacrifices Edict is it's an innovation to demand the entire empire sacrifices it's a big thing to do, and it sort of suggests that this is an emperor who thinks a bit outside the box.
Yeah. And also trying different things.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he calls himself Trajan, which is suggesting, again, interesting propaganda at play. He issues these, no doubt you know about this as a coin enthusiast, he has all those consecratio coins of deified emperors of times past.
Yes, he mints lots of coins with famous, like Hadrian and on the back.
Yeah.
So there's very much a call to the Antonine, and I think also Custis, maybe.
I think Severus Alexander even. Alexander just to get in there.
That might be this calm and normalcy and stability is coming back.
Yes.
Alexander Severus's reign is almost a byword for stability, ironically.
Yes. Yeah, and it's also setting himself up as the next in a line of good emperors, because he said by having all these coins minted, he's comparing them to himself.
Yeah, well, calls himself Trajan.
Yes. And he has these coins also honoring the provinces that the provinces of the Balkans. He clearly understood that the Balkans were to be his power base, and he played into that well by, there's coins honoring Dacia and Pannonia and Illyricum. I mean, but without being as exclusionary as Maximinus Thrax was.
Yeah.
But I think the issue is when we get into his foreign policy and his performance on the battlefield is where it goes bad for him, because not only did he suffer, though he lost at Abritus and lost his life doing so, but he also lost earlier in the previous year to the Goths at the Battle of Beroa, where he was pursuing Cniva's army. Then he stopped his army for a rest, at which point Cniva suddenly, getting word from the scouts, suddenly doubled back and essentially pounced on them while they were making camp, and caused this big defeat that forced Decius to actually withdraw north to the Danube frontier where Gallus was.
Yeah.
And rebuild, and then start, begin the campaign anew the following year, which would then culminate in the Battle of Abritus. And during that interim between those two defeats was when Cniva besieged and took Philippopolis. So he managed to, this Gothic leader managed to take a major city. And to top all that off, the thing is, I haven't come across a source that specifically accuses Decius in particular of doing this. But we know that in either 251 or 252, Shapur invaded Armenia and conquered it. He claims in the Res Gestae of the divine Shapur, Shapur claims that he did it because the Caesar of the Romans didn't keep to his promises. And if we look at the timing of that, so he invaded in either 251 or 252, you'd probably need a year to prepare for an invasion as big as conquering Arsaciid Armenia, ruled by the former Parthian dynasts.
Quite a big kingdom, even sandwiched between the two empires.
Yes, it's and lots of mountains, and they have cataphracts themselves, so they can kind of fight similar battles with them. And yet, it looks like from the timing that Decius is probably the emperor who sinned in this respect. It might be Philip, but it could well be Decius. And if it's Decius, it's insane that he would provoke a war with Shapur while having to deal with the Goths, who are clearly, when you've already got clearly a formidable leader on leading the Goths in the form of Cniva, we know that Shapur, at this point, he's clearly capable of beating Roman armies. And if they knew anything of Persian activities by this point in time, we know that by this point in time, Shapur has essentially expanded into the Kabul Valley and is pushing towards the subcontinent. So this guy is not to be taken lightly. Where by the end of his reign, he can control Sogdiana. So I think it's insane. If Decius is responsible for Armenia starting this new war with Shapur, then that's insane incompetence.
Or maybe...
or he really believes
because
the Gothic
Philip
war
was
quickly.
dead and the agreements had lapsed because of it, Decius didn't restore them, and so that gives Shapur cause for war.
That's a fair point. I mean, maybe Shapur was looking for war. I mean, no doubt he was a warmonger. He would be looking for his chances winning.
You could flip that back on Decius and say, why didn't he pursue these things?
Sure, that's true, yes. Whatever is the case, his reign saw a very badly handled war with the Goths, plus the reignition of war with the Persians. So yeah, I'd say bad.
And some angry Christians. Trebonnianus Gallus becomes emperor with Decius' death because he is the man on the scene with the army, and Hostilian, although he is Caesar, isn't. And also he's quite young, so he's not really a power in himself. And there's two traditions. So Gallus comes to Rome, and he, unlike many other emperors, he doesn't kill Hostilian, at least at first. and actually incorporates him into his family, which does make a lot of sense because Hostilian is the last member of the Decian dynasty, so he is the link to the previous regime. Makes a lot of sense for Gallus to try and keep him alive.
Sure.
And also Gallus was, I wouldn't say a friend of Decius, but closely associated with Decius, so it does make a lot more sense for Gallus to keep Hostilian alive rather than bump him off. But there is a tradition that he did, which I think there is not much sense to. Far more plausible excuses put forward in that Hostilian died of the plague, presumably the Cyprian plague, which is something Gallus is known to have dealt with. I think it's Aurelius Victor that mentions Gallus had to actually start burying people because of the deaths from the Cyprian plague, which had erupted at this time. And so Hostilian, I think, is a victim of the plague rather than some palace conspiracy.
Yeah, I think Hostilian, in terms of ranking, I think he's unrankable because
there's no reign to talk about, really. Just his death.
But it appears more common often in the sources, I think, is the plague version anyway. So I think it also has that on its side. Because I suppose it's a natural suspicion to have that he might have decided, well, Hostilian might be a threat in the future. But I think, as you say, he's sort of his link to the past.
Yeah.
And to legitimacy. Also, he could have eventually adopted him. There's ways in which he could have linked himself into the preceding dynasty in more secure ways that we also see with, the Theodosians and Valentinians linking themselves to the Constantinians. Yeah.
Marriage, adoption. There's lots of ways he could have placated Hostilian after he grew up, because he was still a young teenager. So.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's probably, I suspect it's probably unfair and makes less sense to see it as Gallus is doing. Yeah, I think ultimately Hostilian, like Claudius Gothicus much later, was a victim of epidemic, probably.
Also to remember, a lot of the sources don't like Gallus.
Yes.
Remembered as being supine in the administration of the empire, which is not exactly the most glowing report. Yeah.
And there's also a suspicion that I don't take seriously, but it is probably plays into this, which is that he was viewed as that he betrayed Decius during the Gothic War.
Yeah.
Which I don't think makes sense because it's not clear why the Roman army, why Decius's army would therefore support him if this was a particularly apparent fact. And I also think the Roman sources have a tendency, perhaps a bit like the Philip Gordian issue, and a bit also later with Valerian and Shapur. There's some sources use treachery to explain their defeats. And I think they use it as a bit of a get-out-jail-free card when they've been genuinely outplayed on the battlefield. So, yeah, I think that might be a part of it too, that because there's this later idea in the later sources that Trebonnianus Gallus betrayed Decius on the battlefield, then it makes sense for him to have killed Hostilian as well.
So he'd be a traitor and a murderer.
Yes.
And I think in the administration.
Yeah, and I think Trebonnianus Gallus, I'm not sure how to... I find him genuinely difficult to sort of assess because we don't have a lot of info, really. He had to deal with... There's a lot that was outside of his control. He had to deal with this, as you say, the Cyprian plague. We know that there was defeats in the east because at this point in time, or by 253, the last year of his reign, I mean, we know only thanks to Shapur, but we know that he pressed into Syria and defeated the Roman provincial army at Barbarissus and defeated tens of thousands of Romans. We know from Roman sources he sacked Antioch itself, the most important city in Syria. He raided as far as Cappadocia and Cilicia. He then started focusing on fortresses in Upper Mesopotamia. So things are going badly in the east, but Gallus isn't there. And I guess that's a problem that he isn't there to deal with this issue, but perhaps he didn't have much time to, because if this invasion happened... Yeah, he hasn't been emperor for very long, and I guess Shapur needed time to actually conquer Armenia. So generally the fall of Antioch is dated to 253, and it was a surprise march on the city, wasn't a long siege. And so it seems like this all started happening in the last months of Gallus's reign, and so we can't really blame him for not being there. Maybe
My take on Gallus is he comes across, I mean, we have to take the biases, the sources to one side, I think, but he comes across as a capable emperor, but completely hamstrung by the situation he was in. Yeah, frontiers were collapsing. He's eventually destroyed by Aemilian, because when he rebels, Gallus's troops murder him. He's clearly able to inspire some loyalty, though, because Valerian rebels against Aemilian's rebellion.
Yes, Valerian was off collecting troops for Gallus at the time, yeah.
Gallus is responsible for dealing with the Cyprian plague, so starting to bury the dead, these kinds of things, which he's trying to establish his own dynasties, and incorporating Decius as one. I think it's a case of he was really in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I think it's because of all of these failures around him that a lot of the later dislike of him comes from. Why are the frontiers crumbling? Clearly because Gallus couldn't even spell his name properly, let alone run the empire properly. And then why was he eventually killed? Well, because he was rubbish emperor, traitor, murderer, these sorts of things.
Exactly. I think he's getting the same treatment that Gallienus. I mean, we'll get to Gallienus, but I think it's the same treatment. It's considered a problem of the personality of the emperor that the empire is having problems. When in Gallus's case, he didn't even have time to really do anything. I mean, Zosimus calls him negligent and lazy, but I think that seems like that's the same kind of accusation that is levied against Gallienus. When we know that Gallienus was actually very militarily active. There's plenty of campaigns. And so I think it becomes a sort of an easy explanation for these ancient authors to conclude, well, Gallus was just lazy. Yeah, so but I'm genuinely not sure how I'd rank him then, because I guess I would go with mediocre, but that's just the default, I guess.
I think it's the odd one of, I'm going to put him in incompetent, but I don't think he was incompetent. I think it's just the situation he was in was almost untenable.
That's fair.
I think it's also telling about the state of the frontiers at this point, in that Aemilian was proclaimed emperor because of this big victory he has. I think it's over the Goths. Was it the Goths or Germans?
It was the Goths, yeah.
And he's proclaimed emperor because of that. The frontiers are crumbling, and as soon as a half-decent solution comes along, his reign comes to end very quickly. Because he marches out to meet Aemilian, and then his troops just murder him instead.
Yes.
And his son Volusian.
Yeah, which I guess is a point in his favour, that he'd set up a successor for himself, even if the successor was killed along with him. I think, and I think he also gets a bit of hate in the sources because he allowed the Goths. He basically he made peace with the Goths after that defeat. But it sounds like, while there was enough of an army to proclaim him emperor, it sounds like after those two defeats, they weren't in a position to be stopping the Goths from returning to their homeland.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess incompetent. Yeah, poor makes sense. But I guess it's not clear how much it's really his fault.
Aemilian doesn't reign for very long. I think of him almost as the most stereotypical emperor of the 3rd century crisis, in that he is a successful general, proclaimed emperor because of that. He defeats the reigning emperor / overcomes the reigning emperor, then has to deal with another usurper, in this case Florian, and he is killed by his own troops.
Yeah,
because of that.
He's the epitome of the period, pretty much.
Yeah. I think it's Eutropius who says something like, Aemilian did nothing worthy of note during his reign. It's just like complete. It's like his entire reign. Nothing notable.
I think he managed. I think maybe I'm misremembering this, but I think he actually had time to make his wife an empress. He may have pulled that off.
There's also an interesting story that is preserved in Peter the Patrician, where Aemilian sends a letter to Rome saying that he will act as commander-in-chief and the Senate will govern the empire in Rome.
Ah.
I would hesitate to say he's restoring the Republic, because no emperor restored the Republic.
No.
Augustus twice considered doing that himself. He thought it was a bad idea. It might be, if we take it as a genuine thing, is that he's trying something different. Okay, maybe... So I'm a soldier. Maybe one way to get the Senate on my side is to say that you can do all the administrative stuff, and I'll be out in the field defeating the enemies, which I think is, just on paper, sounds like quite a good solution to the problem.
Yeah, that's
It's just
not a bad idea.
his reign only lasts a few months, so it never really took any effect. But
Yeah, I think he had 4 months, maybe. I think, and it was all in the context of that civil war going on, because Valerian had, was still at arms and had then declared himself emperor.
Yeah.
So he didn't have the time. No.
it's just a kind of interesting note about his reign, that there is this kind of strange compromise between emperor and senate, which you don't really see with anyone else.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing to bring up. I didn't remember that passage. I know that Peter the Patrician is another one of those sources who it would be great to have the history in its entirety, as opposed to little fragments.
I know he preserves the speculated continuator of Cassius Dio.
Yes, there's a bit of debate and scholarship about whether they're different or not, but probably it's all Peter Patrician. Yeah, that he's continuing. I mean, either it is that he's containing the continuator, or he himself happens to be the continuator. Yeah, Aemilian, I guess I consider him okay. I think it's hard to... I mean, he doesn't have very long. But I guess to his credit, so he does win, this large victory over the Goths as a general in a period that was clearly it was a bad time for the empire, and yet he wins this victory. It may well have been an exaggerated victory, but it was enough. He defeated these Goths had penetrated into Moesia Inferior, and he defeated them, and then he counterattacked into Gothic territory, or supposedly rescued much of the plunder. So that's quite significant. And it was enough to get him declared emperor. Admittedly, not a high standard in this period. It was easy to get declared emperor, fairly easy. But it's something that we...
The Roman emperor at this point.
But I guess it's something we can work with in assessing Aemilian. And I think, Zosimus says that there was no... Aemilian essentially defeated Gallus without a fight, that he showed up and then Gallus was killed by its own men. I think Zonorus actually does say that there was a battle, but Zonorus may be copying. Their mistakes may well have entered the tradition in the centuries between those two histories.
Yeah.
He was then killed by his own soldiers when Valerian showed up, and the reasoning given is that he appeared more like a rogue soldier than an emperor in the eyes of the soldiers. I guess based on what little we have, I don't know, maybe I'm being generous with okay, maybe he's mediocre. Maybe he's even worse than that. But from what little he did, he started off decent, it seems to me.
Perhaps because his reign is so short that there's not that much to really say against him, other than he died. So, successful general, largely, as an element of he was trying to sort out some kind of modus vivendi or modus operandi, or both, trying to cope with the crisis and also secure his own power. And also he comes up against Valerian, who was a Gallus loyalist, and his troops decide to avoid a battle and just murder him. So I don't think he's incompetent, bad, but he's definitely not decent.
Sure. Yeah, I guess mediocre sums it up. It's not like he actually lost the battle even, but he didn't exactly accomplish a great deal. It was 4 months. I mean, and not that he had the time to, but I guess there isn't enough there to push him beyond mediocre.
Valerian, he comes to the throne after Aemilian is dead, And he ends up setting up a quite interesting regime, which lasts for about 7 years, if I recall. What he does, which is quite interesting in its innovation, is he divides the empire between himself and his son Gallienus. Gallienus is in charge of the west, pretty much. Valerian takes charge of the east and Balkan provinces. Not only does he have 2 co-emperors, co-Augusti, but he also places his grandson, Valerian II, as Caesar, who is in nominal charge of the Danube area. So he's got 3 imperial presences around the empire. And this system, which I personally like to call the Valerian diarchy, because it's kind of like a rule of 2, and definitely has ideas of the future tetrarchy are starting to take place to try and solve the issues surrounding the 3rd century crisis. And his reign is very much a mixed bag. The empire is under increasing external pressure. Also, the threat from the Sassanids returns, which is where eventually in 260 he leads his army east. Some of the sources describe it as he is duped into making terms with the Sassanids, and during the meeting he is arrested and taken prisoner, which leaves the empire in a spot of bother. But because he has set up this system with Gallienus and Valerian II, who's actually dies before Valerian is captured, he actually has, I wouldn't call it a smooth succession, but you have the passage of the monarchy from one emperor to his heir successfully. Gallienus continues to hold power until 268. So Valerian, in some respects, is fairly successful politically, if little else. He also sets up many mints in the empire to more efficiently pay soldiers. He also one of his policies is to start an active persecution of the Christian community. 3rd century seems to have an interesting, almost self-made issue of the Christian problem, which Valerian decides to try and remedy by persecuting them. In Eusebius, it's described as a man from Egypt basically poisons his mind against them for various reasons, and it's through this method that Valerian starts to persecute Christians, and then he gets his divine retribution when he's captured by the Persians and used as a footstool, and then eventually skinned and hung up on a temple wall. But this is the first properly directed persecution that we know some actual features of. There is an earlier persecution mentioned by Lactantius by Maximinus I Thrax, but I'm not aware of any of the details about that. I'm not sure if there are even any martyrs from it. But one of the most prominent martyrs from Valerian's persecution is Saint Cyprian, who is executed around this time. It's a mixed bag for Valerian. Again, the situation is dire, to put it generously, but he's starting to come to grips with some of the problems the empire is facing, not only enacting real solutions to solve these problems, but they're also continued by his successor Gallienus. What do you think of Valerian?
Yes, I think he was, he seems to have been, this was someone who was putting a good amount of effort into making making things work. I think right at the outset, I suppose I can't think of many other examples. Maybe there are other examples deeper into Byzantine history, but I can't think of many examples where the general who was sent by the previous emperor to collect reinforcements, but then the previous emperor is overthrown, he nevertheless then just becomes emperor and manages to beat the seemingly the victor in the civil war. Although I suppose the year of 6 emperors and 238 is a bit like that. So that seems to suggest some sort of spark of competence in the year 253 when he takes power. And yeah, I think it is an impressive leadership arrangement where, yeah, he does form this diarchy, nominally a triarchy because of the Caesar.
Yeah.
Where, yes, Gallienus is basically taking control of. Seems to be for most of the time, Gallienus has the mammoth task of protecting both the Rhine and the Danube to a degree. With Valerian II
as
eventually
body in the east.
Eventually being placed on the Danube as this sort of figurehead, with the general Ingenuus perhaps being the one with more practical power on that frontier.
It's a similar arrangement to Saloninus after Valerian dies. Saturninus. Yeah. He's placed as effectively the regent for Saloninus.
Actually, Silvanus, the Guardian is
Silvanus, yes.
Yes.
Silvanus is kind of a regent for Saloninus along the Rhine, while Gallienus takes effective control of the rest of the empire. The only issue with the Valerian diarchy is that he runs out of family members, basically, and he also runs out of adult family members. So Valerian II's dead before he's even dead. Then he gets captured, and then there's only 2 left. And then Saloninus is also murdered by Postumus in 260. In only a couple of years or so, the fairly solid political situation that Valerian sets up is almost completely undone, so that by the first few years of Gallienus's reign, it's just him, and he doesn't have any heirs. He has the problem of who does he pass his empire on to.
I think actually, they have some pretty bad luck. Definitely the original 3, through some sheer bad luck, original 4, it gets whittled down to Gallienus in the space of 3 years.
Yeah.
Where you have Valerian II, we don't know how he died, but he died, and so they replaced him with Saloninus, who is then, as you say, set up on the Rhine when Gallienus has to return to Italy to deal with an invasion of Italy by the Alemanni. But actually, there are, in the 260s, you do get little hints and just names without much personality attached in the sources to 2 figures in the family who are there. But it actually seems a little bit, my take on it would be that Gallienus, after having lost both his sons, one for reasons no longer known to us and the other because of Postumus's rebellion, having lost both of his sons and his father, maybe sort of backed off the Imperial College idea, because he does have a brother, yes, Licinius Valerianus, and he was consul in 266 maybe, and we know that, I think Zonorus mentions that he was butchered by the Senate in 268 when they heard that Gallienus had been assassinated.
Yeah.
They also mention that he had a surviving son who was butchered in that same event, and that might be Murinianus. There is some reference in the sources to a boy called Murinianus. I think he may have even been set up as consul in 268, the year Gallienus is killed. So maybe Gallienus very slowly restoring his own confidence in setting up an imperial college, lest his family members are again put in the firing line.
Yeah, Gallienus's wife also dies as well, so it's quite a slew of family tragedy for Gallienus, which might perhaps explain a little bit why he doesn't really appoint anyone else from his family.
Yeah, he may have been a bit scarred by it all. I definitely, though, bringing up the women, that does kind of tie into another strong aspect of Valerian's arrangement, which is he also did really promote the empresses. Like, we have inscriptions and coins mentioning Salonina, the wife of Gallienus, as Augusta Empress. Again, all a part of this dynastic self-presentation. There are also coins of, her name is Muriniana, and she seems to have been the wife of Valerian, but she was dead by the time he became emperor, and she's honored as Diwa, deified woman.
Yeah.
So they would so to Valerian's credit, he made a strong a strong show of he made what seemed to be a strong imperial college and buffered it up with all the dynastic trappings, and so that created some sort of, I guess, for the period, of vague longevity. I mean, it is striking that between 253 and his capture in 260, it's debatable that there were any usurpations, and if they were insignificant. It may be that there's just the only ones that happened in that 7 years might be just fictional ones made up by the Historia Augusta.
Yeah.
And so they seem to have established quite an exceptional degree of stability. As you say, this is also the period when the empire is starting to expand the imperial mints, creating more and more imperial mints in the provinces in a way that's going to be very convenient for the army. Ready access to coinage in Serdica and Antioch, right near the frontiers. So that's an important development that will continue to be developed by future emperors.
Valerian and Gallienus, between them, set up the most mints during the 3rd century out of any of the emperors.
Oh, wow.
I can't remember the exact figure, but it was like a good dozen or so mints that were set up, and they're all, you can tell they're for the army because of where they're being set up. They're like in the Balkans, in the east, near the right. They're all right near the frontier, so that coins can be quickly minted and issued to the soldiers. It's also logistics as well. You don't have to mint coins in Rome, then cart them over to the frontiers to pay the troops. The distance between the two is massively shortened by having your mint in Siscia or Byzantium or somewhere like that. Certainly,
and I think, Valerian does seem to be putting a good amount of thought into having emperors on the different frontiers and the East provincial imperial mints. He's clearly putting a lot of thought into how you protect the frontiers. There's even epigraphic, inscriptional evidence of this sort of super general of Africa in this period that was created. This Octavianus, general of Mauritania, Numidia, and Africa, because evidently there were issues with the Moors at this time.
Right.
And so he created this kind of super-regional command to deal with the issue. Where he falls short, Valerian, so I mean the big one is, of course, his capture.
Yeah. It's a massive humiliation. He's the only emperor to be captured out of the Roman emperors, and another emperor isn't captured again until 1071 at the Battle of Manzikert. So
yeah. I mean, so
if for a long kind of lives in infamy.
I think I remember seeing artwork of the capture of, is it Romanus, the guy at Manzikert?
Romanus IV, yes.
Yeah, with the foot of Alp Arslan on his neck, I think, which sort of reminds one of Valerian being used as a footstool. And might be perhaps, I suppose that's a unit, this sort of symbol of submission, but maybe it's also inspired by the Valerian stories. Yeah, as we mentioned, as we talked about with Decius, the persecution stuff I think does need to be contextualized. So it makes sense why Valerian, this sort of clearly a bit of a problem solver emperor, would decide later in his reign, I think 257 it begins, that maybe the Christians are trouble. But that's not excusable, but it sort of makes sense in terms of, so he didn't do amazingly against Gothic raids, for example. We do hear about towns and fortresses along the coasts of Asia Minor, and also Colchis on the Black Sea being sacked by Herulian Goths. And so there seems to have been some trouble on that front.
I think that's another interesting thing, that the Goths use ships to attack the Empire. If I recall, there's a huge Gothic campaign in that area. They sacked all sorts of cities like Athens and so on, which in times gone by had been fairly safe. I know that Athens had no walls since Sulla tore them down in the last century BC. And then when the Goths came running, they quickly, I think in one of the Dexippon fragments. He mentions how the Athenians had to quickly throw up a wall, and I think there are actually still archaeological remains of when they threw this wall up, because it was done in such haste. They built the wall through the forum and stuff like that.
Right.
So
Yeah.
the Goths were a real threat, and the unique use of ships, like the Vandals later on, gave the Romans a bit of a shock, really.
Because Zosimus mentions that they were they'd threatened merchants and sailors into giving them, or basically sailing them around, or giving them their ships. Yeah, they'd sort of show up near the Bosphorus and take control of these fleets. Yeah, I think, and that's a problem that'll get much worse in the reign of Gallienus. We're sort of seeing the beginnings of those troubles under Valerian.
Yeah.
But Edessa, I mean, I think it's hard to... I have some sympathy for him here, because his army was suffering from plague. Meanwhile, Shapur is besieging Edessa. And so Valerian shows up to try and make a show of force, it seems, and intimidate Shapur, but he doesn't offer battle because he knows his army is weak. And he seems to be waiting for reinforcements, I guess from Gallienus, maybe from someone else. But we're told that the garrison... I mean, there are lots of various accounts of this campaign, but from what we can piece together from the details, the garrison at Edessa successfully sallied against the Persians in a way that gave Valerian unearned confidence. And he therefore appears to have accepted battle with Shapur after seeing the good job that the garrison did against him. And there's some vague reference to Shapur managed to surround his army, outflank them, I guess with superior numbers of cavalry and just better cavalry, and got him in a bad position, defeated him, and Valerian ultimately was forced to negotiate with him, at which point he got captured. So you can sort of see how he got to that point, but it's there are other points during his reign where things weren't going that great on the eastern frontier. We know that during Europos, we can see from archaeology that during Europos was sacked and never, this important fortress on the, I think it's on the Euphrates. It's either the Euphrates or one of the tributaries, but was sacked and would never be repopulated.
Yeah.
And we can see the siege works with these extensive. There's even evidence of what looks to be chemical warfare, where Shapur, his soldiers in this battle in the underground tunnels appear to have been pumping some kind of poisonous gas at the Romans, and there's this big pile. They found this pile of dead Romans. Yeah, piled there after this gas attack. And this is something that evidently Valerian wasn't able to stop. Shapur, incidentally, just on a side note, seems to have been quite good at siege warfare, because he also took Hatra back in 240, which Trajan had failed to take. Septimius Severus had twice failed to take. Ardashir, his father, had failed to take. Hatra, and again, this is something where archaeology has shown these really massive Persian siege works. He clearly put a lot of effort into these sieges. Yeah. But I guess, returning to Valerian. So I guess I view him somewhere on the spectrum of mediocre to okay, because I think he was someone who was thinking about his issues, the problems of the empire, and was trying to find solutions. It's hard for me to be too generous because of his capture.
Yeah.
On a side note, the issue of his fate is an interesting one. There's a case to be made that actually... So Lactantius is the earliest source we have for him being used as a footstool and for his body being flayed.
Yeah.
The body being flayed, that might actually be an allusion to the execution of Mani, who was executed later in the 3rd century by one of... that might actually be an allusion to that, because... the footstool thing actually seems to be an allusion to one of the Psalms, where it's something about making a footstool of your enemy. And there's an alternate version of events by the Arab historian Al-Tabari, who's generally regarded as a bit more reliable when it comes to Persian history. He says that actually Valerian was given a dam to administer the construction of a dam in Sistar in Persia. And he and his prisoners of war constructed this dam, and then he was either mutilated and released, or he was just executed after that. But seems to have been, made to do some work for them as an administrator. Yeah, Altabari is unsure whether he was mutilated and then released, or was just executed. Mutilated and then released sort of ties into that sort of, the Byzantines knew all about that. As for the Egyptian thing, that's kind of interesting, really. The whole, when you mention the Egyptian advising Valerian to conduct the persecution, I wonder, therefore, if Zosimus is alluding to that. And he says that Constantine adopted Christianity on the advice of an Egyptian. I mean, Zosimus appears to actually be referring to Hosius of Cordoba, but he refers to him as an Egyptian. And I wonder if that's some kind of nod to Eusebius. But anyway, yeah, so I guess I'm somewhere on the mediocre to okay scale for Valerian.
I would agree. I think he is a mediocre emperor. Not so much saying that he was incapable, but there are some good parts to his reign and there are some bad parts to his reign, and it kind of meets in the middle. His capture, great humiliation, he's lost his army, and then the east is completely exposed to attack. But his empire is, I wouldn't say secure. You get the idea that the steps that Diocletian would take to end the crisis of the 3rd century, you see being taken by Valerian and Gallienus at this point. And he certainly had a lot of problems to try and tackle. Some of the ways he dealt with them, so like lots of mints to mint money for the army, but at the same time, the actual value of those coins being minted went down significantly. So like at the start of his reign, so under Aemilian, the Antoninianus, which was essentially the kind of standard currency of the empire, you had the copper coins, the silver coins, and the gold coins, which weren't used or minted as much, but you had the silver coins were the ones that were minted most. And it went from 35% in the beginning of Valerian's reign to 15% silver content in the Antoninianus by the end of his reign, 7 years later. And also the actual weight of the coin went down by 5 grams, from 3.4 to 2.9. So not only is the silver in the coins getting lower, but the actual coins themselves are worth less. So, which also had a knock-on effect for the copper coinage, which was tied to the silver coins, in that it's in his reign that most of the smaller copper coin denominations like the As and the Dupondius stop being minted, because by this point they're virtually worthless.
Yeah.
And also the Sestercius, which is the grand, massive blob of a coin, that eventually stops being minted as well, because the copper becomes almost completely worthless compared to the silver coin, which is continuously being worth less by emperors.
Right.
So
that's not great.
He's causing problems to solve other problems.
And ultimately his capture will exacerbate the problems even more.
Yeah, that's the thing. I came across this very good extract from a Oxyrhynchus papyrus, 1411, from 260. It's quite short, so I'll read it out for everyone. So, since this is in Egypt, by the way, so since the public officials have assembled and accused the bankers of the banks of exchange of having closed them on account of their unwillingness to accept the divine coins of the emperor, it has become necessary that an injunction should be issued to all the owners of the banks to open them, and to accept and exchange all coin except the absolutely spurious and counterfeit, and not only to them, but to all who engage in business transactions and any kind whatsoever, knowing that if they disobey this injunction, they will experience the penalties ordained for them previously by His Highness the Prefect. So, I think this really gets a good idea of kind of the economic disruption that's happening because of everything that's going on at the moment.
Yeah, that people need to be threatened to use these coins.
Yeah, it's like the banks don't want to open anymore because they don't trust the coins they're using, and now the local nomarch of the Oxyrhynchus, Oxyrhynchus, and he's been forced to have these banks thrown open to continue trading.
Yeah.
To just keep the economy going.
Yeah, that is pretty telling.
Yeah. So, it's one example, and I think there are others, but I think it helps to illustrate the not just military problems, but also the dire economic problems that are happening as well, which also feeds into the military problems in that people are becoming more discontent, the morale kind of fluctuates considerably. If you don't have enough money to pay the troops, they're not going to fight, and so on.
Or they may do worse.
Yeah, or just the complete disruption of daily life at this period.
Yeah.
Much of the empire. There are some places, like I think Africa, the effects of the crisis are far less felt, but other places like the Balkans just get completely laid waste to. The Balkans, kind of northern Italy, Gaul, Britain,
sure, by the end of the 3rd century, archaeology does show that Britain and parts of northern Gaul have show signs of serious neglect after a while, like, much urban decline, a diminishing of the military forces present, and there's a paper out there that argues that Amorica in Gaul basically suffered a sort of social and demographic collapse for a period of time during this era. Yeah, Africa, that seems to be doing much better. There's still a lot of building activity. Since we're talking about the economic factors that are sort of beyond, that are going to be affecting the ability of the empire to function. Also climate, we're getting to a point in the century where climate would be a factor, because paleoclimatological work has shown that there were a bunch of volcanic winters caused by volcanoes elsewhere in the world. That appears to have caused a period of dry, cool weather in northern Europe, which is probably one of the reasons why the Germanic peoples east of the Rhine, north of the Danube, the worlds they live in are probably being affected quite badly from a climatological perspective, and that's going to be affecting their agriculture. So that might be a reason why they're also having to rely more on plunder than before. We also know that the Nile, again, paleoclimatological work suggests that the Nile flood was becoming more irregular in this period as well. So that would be affecting grain production. And of course, there's, returning to the foreign policy side of things, the 250s is also the first time we hear of the Franks. And they appear to have become quite a strong confederation, just like the Alemanni were, who are first attested in the 210s. And the Goths first attested in the 230s. So we're seeing this rise in these large Germanic confederations as well. Maybe in some way related to climate, but in some way they're clearly there's something dangerous happening on the frontiers.
The barbarian kingdoms themselves are, by this point in the 3rd century, the gap between them and the Romans has decreased quite a lot. They are more organized. They're starting to be more like kingdoms rather than your more traditional barbarous tribes. Their weapons and armor are more on par with the Romans. Not quite the same, but they are improving significantly, as well as elements of training and cohesion.
Yeah, I guess the thing is, the longer the Romans are interacting with the Germans, and the longer these frontiers are stable, the more that the Germans are going to be influenced by Roman military tactics and organization and political power structures. And so to a degree, it doesn't surprise that simply naturally over time, the Germanic peoples, especially when they're being preyed upon by ambitious generals and emperors, are going to start taking a page out of the Romans and will start forming these larger confederations whether to plunder more efficiently or to defend themselves better.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's sort of a natural progression.
The Emperor Saloninus, I find him difficult to rank. I appreciate when we talk about him, we're basically talking about Silvanus, his regent. From what I understand, he was a very competent and loyal commander. The Rhine was largely secured by him, and also when rebellion did break out, he remained loyal to Saloninus and Gallienus, rather than join the posthumous revolt. I can't remember why Posthumus revolted.
Basically because, and this is why I'd regard Saloninus, well, I guess I'd regard him as a poor emperor, because this is literally the one thing he's recorded as doing, and it resulted in his overthrow. But I also think he had good reason to do it, so I wouldn't say so. But okay, so we know that a bunch of Germans, probably Franks, had penetrated deep into Gaul and were returning. And so Silvanus was the guardian of Saloninus, and Posthumus was the general of the Rhine frontier. It looks as though what happened was Posthumus waited for these Franks to return to the Rhine frontier to get back across. Posthumus attacked them and defeated them. Then he started distributing the plunder that had been captured by the Franks to the troops. Now Silvanus and Saloninus, well, Saloninus with Silvanus's de facto decision-making or guidance, they decided that the plunder shouldn't be distributed to the troops, but should be returned to the people of Gaul, because, and with good reason, I guess, because they had been, this is plunder, this isn't, plunder taken from German villages. This is plunder taken from Roman citizens by the Franks that, in an ideal world, would be returned to them. But the problem is, because Posthumus had already perhaps knowingly, made this power move of distributing, without imperial consent, distributing the plunder to the soldiers, it therefore was going to look really bad when Saloninus and Silvanus try to confiscate the plunder that had just been distributed to the troops. Yeah, and so in a way, Posthumus perhaps deliberately entrapped them. But the reason why Saloninus and Silvanus would do this is, I guess, it's morally good. But in this period, it's also just a bad political miscalculation. So that's essentially why I'd regard him as a poor emperor, because ultimately that decision got him killed. And perhaps should have predicted that would be the case.
I think it's ironic that 8 years later, Posthumus is killed for a very similar reason.
Yes.
Mainz rebels, and then they take it, and then Posthumus tries to stop them sacking the city, and then they murder him.
It's the exact same mistake. Yeah, it's very ironic. The only emperor in the period who managed to do something like that and not get killed for it is Aurelian.
Yeah.
And that was Tiana, which I guess we'll get to, but, it's the whole... Well, we'll get to it, but he managed to pull it off.
By the skin of his teeth, by the sounds of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think incompetent.
Sure.
Yeah, sometimes discretion is the better part of valor.
Yes.
Gallienus is a very interesting emperor to me. I'm tempted to put him in good, actually. If you look at the face of it, his reign sees the Roman Empire reach its worst situation ever since it became a superpower. Gaul, with Posthumus and the death of Saloninus, you've got Gaul, Spain, and Britain joined Posthumus in rebellion. The east is almost overrun by Chapo, and it's only saved by Odenathus, who basically becomes the supreme commander of the east for Gallienus.
Yeah, it kind of becomes a viceroy.
The Balkans are many major cities are sacked, like Byzantium. His family all dies off, and then he's murdered in 268 after having fought off a slew of usurpers. But you also have a lot of things happen during his long reign. I think he's the longest reigning emperor since Septimius Severus, from 253 to 268, which in this period...
This is amazing, really.
This period, it's almost like a lifetime. Has a lot of initiatives during his reign, and you see a lot of things start to change, which you eventually see them come to their fruition in the under Diocletian and in the 4th century. So Gallienus stops appointing senators. The Senate is almost completely cut out of his reign in any role. He starts appointing equestrians. So the equestrians were the lower aristocracy from the provinces rather than the Senate and senatorial families.
It also makes it easier for career officers to enter the equestrian order. So he's sort of pushing up this particular class of equestrians, these experienced military professionals, into these military commands.
There had been previous emperors that had started to promote equestrians, like Gordian III, and Timotheus was a equestrian.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's Gallienus that really pushes the equestrians, and at the exclusion of the Senate, which has the effect that he gets the worst write-up of any of the emperors from this period, pretty much. He's described as being lazy and incompetent and a good for nothing, basically. And then they go on to describe all of his good deeds.
There's just this ongoing cliche of the lazy Gallienus, sort of effeminate lazy Gallienus.
You then read other accounts like the life of Plotinus, which only has good things to say about Gallienus and gives you an insight into not only was he beginning to reform the army and the frontiers and so on, but also he was a great patron of the arts during his reign. There is a story retold in the life of Plotinus, written by Porphyry, who's a later pagan philosopher, where Plotinus approaches Gallienus and asks him to give him a city which he can run in the style of Plato's Republic. And Gallienus is almost on board with the idea, but is talked out of it right at the last minute. But it gives you the kind of impression that Gallienus is a little like Hadrian in a way, in that he is looking at kind of art and religion and doing things to patronize it and promote it, and is interested in this stuff. I mean, some people call it the Gallienic Renaissance.
Yeah, fascinating.
And also there's a change in sculpture for Gallienus, in that his eyes are always looking up at heaven rather than straight ahead. He starts to look a little bit more like how emperors are portrayed under Diocletian and later, and that is a completely unnatural, idealized version of them rather than the more natural peak performance of natural. You know, it's like you look at someone like Septimius, a bust of Septimius Severus, and he looks very realistic and very almost true to life. And then you look at starting with Gallienus and then especially the Tetrarchy, where they're completely featureless and their eyes are bulging out of their skulls and so on.
Gallienus' later sculptures seem to sort of combine. It's not at that abstract level that we get with the Tetrarchs yet, but it has the eyes looking upwards combined with a sort of Alexandrian, he's got the Alexandrian hair and Hellenistic heroism, but slowly kind of showing the way to the very typically late antique symbolism that these sculptures end up having.
And he enacts some military reforms, the most famous of which is that he forms a cavalry corps. The Romans did, of course, use cavalry before this, but it was very small in scale. And Gallienus is the first to have a elite cavalry corps that goes with him. It's almost like a proto army in the emperor's presence that you'll see under the late Roman military system. And also strategy begins to change. I think it had already started to change under Valerian, but you really see it in Gallienus's reign, in that there's more of what's described as an elastic defense. So rather than trying to take out the barbarians at the frontiers, which by this point had pretty much all collapsed, the Hadrianic defenses have been completely overrun. Instead, you have the army centered, in Gallienus's case, in Milan, and then when the enemy attack, he rides out to meet them, and as they're starting to head back to wherever they came from, he attacks them and decimates them, and then that's that threat gone. The only trouble with that is that they've already pillaged and plundered their way through half the countryside by that point. For the victims of barbarian attack, it's not that great, but militarily you start to see the empire really starting to get to grips with the barbarian invasions going on. So like there's a battle at Nasus against the Goths, which Gallienus wins. It's a big victory. That it doesn't crush the Goths, but it's a really major victory. And it's from this point onwards, under Gallienus, Claudius II, Aurelian, that you start seeing major victories being won against various barbarian and also rebel groups. They're taken out one by one, whereas before they were kind of pushed off or defeated the Roman forces. So the countryside by the end of the day is completely devastated, but they are starting to have more military success. So
yes, I view him, I'd go so far as to call him a great emperor. I think, there's my only criticism of him is the obvious one, that he failed to reunify the empire. But I think the only emperor in this period who was going to pull that off, at least in the 260s, at the height of this crisis, you needed someone like an Aurelian to pull that off. Gallienus is he does what he can, and he does a pretty good job of it. He seems to be kind of, for 8 years there, he's the ultimate survivor, those 8 years between his father's capture and his own assassination, where, his father's capture just causes this massive, it just turns up the notch on this crisis in a huge way.
Yeah. We have the rebellion of Macrianus, don't you?
Yes. Yeah, that's it. I mean, we've got so many at once. We've got Posthumus on the Rhine. We've got Macrianus and his two sons in the east. We have Ingenuus in Pannonia, who is then taken out, but then another usurper, Regalianus, makes a move. I mean, when Macrianus is taken out and his sons are defeated, there is another Aemilian takes power in Egypt, and he seems to have been a loyalist of the Macriani, and he has to get defeated. Gallienus sends this admiral, Theodotus, to get rid of him. There's also a couple of usurpers who might be unhistorical, but we are told of Piso in Thessaly and Valens in Greece. Valens was sent against Piso by Macrianus, and Piso was a loyalist of Gallienus, but then they both become usurpers. So that might be unhistorical, but it does sort of reflect just how insane this period was. Gallienus, even before 260, really forces him to be this great emperor, in my opinion. Even before that, he's the more energetic of the two, I'd say, when it comes to Valerian. Like, he from circa 254 to 256, he's stationed on the middle Danube, and that's possibly the original context of this cavalry, the sort of cavalry-heavy central army the central reserve that he creates. It may have been in the context of dealing with Vandal, because we know that there was archaeology shows that Pannonia suffered pretty badly in this period, and so maybe in that context that Gallienus developed this army where, because the frontiers were running out of troops. Dacia, for example, was at about half strength by this point. And so Gallienus has this central reserve that allows him to, as you say, it's not great for the inhabitants, who are, no matter what they're going to get, they're going to suffer. But at the very least, these raiders can then get rounded up by this quicker moving, smaller reserve army that makes heavy use of cavalry and also vexallations of infantry, and is able to round them up. It's also an army that is better able to deal with threats like Persian cataphracts and Sarmatian cataphracts and various, Gothic cavalry. It's becoming increasingly the case that a bit more effort on the cavalry, in terms of cavalry, is increasingly necessary, and Gallienus seems to recognize that. And so, yeah, I mean, 254 to 256, he's dealing with Vandals and Sarmatians. 257 to 259, he's dealing with the Franks. He then has to go to Italy to deal with this big Alemannic invasion of Italy and defeats them outside Milan. Then his father gets captured, and that causes all these other issues to occur. And he rapidly defeats Ingenuus. We're told that he did some kind of outflanking maneuver with his cavalry. So the reforms paid off even against the usurper.
I think the only person that defeats him is Postumus. Gallienus attacks him, or he sends Aureolus to attack Postumus, and Postumus defeats him. And then Gallienus just stations troops on the frontier to keep an eye on Postumus, but basically leaves him to it.
He seems to have made a couple of attempts. So we know that he appears to have retaken Rhaetia quite early in Postumus's usurpation. Gallienus appears to have wrested control of Rhaetia from Postumus, and that's a very important sort of strategic gain. It's a good defensive buffer.
What's the way into the Alps, which is the way into Italy? So have to protect Rome.
Yes, and it's a place where you wouldn't want a bunch of legions loyal to Postumus sitting directly to the north of Italy. He then does he defeats Ingenuus, and then I think his general Aureolus defeats Regalianus, the other usurper in Pannonia, and then Aureolus defeats Macrianus, and then he makes his move against Postumus into Gaul proper. And yes, he appears to have suffered an initial defeat to Postumus, but then defeated him, and then sent Aureolus to pursue him. And I think Zonorus says that Aureolus, through laziness, failed to capture Postumus, and thus failed to put the nail in the coffin. And then there was another campaign. We don't really know the years involved in these campaigns, but we know that Postumus, was able to recover because they didn't manage to capture him. And so then Gallienus managed to again defeat Postumus and besiege him in a city where the city isn't named. And on that occasion, Gallienus suffered an arrow. He got hit by an arrow and was badly wounded. And so then he withdrew. And it seems that the siege was ultimately called off, and thus Postumus managed to get yet another chance to survive. So here he was unable to. He seems to have kind of repeatedly gotten the better of Postumus, but couldn't quite finish him.
Yeah.
One great anecdote in Peter the Patrician, and you can totally see why Gallienus would do this, because his son Saloninus had been killed by Postumus. He supposedly offered to single combat Postumus. I love that. It just makes sense, because poor Gallienus would be such a frustrated, grief-stricken. He had good reason to be frustrated and angry. I mean, so meanwhile, while all this is happening, he also has to deal with Goths and Heruli, who are now really ratcheting up. They've really amped up.
Pushing into the Balkans.
Yes, and the Aegean and Asia Minor, and so he has to deal with that. And there's an indication that the garrison in Byzantium let the Goths through and were rebelling themselves. And on that occasion, Gallienus clearly just fed up. Because it also looks like from the chronology, Lucas de Blois points this out, that it looks like from the chronology that this is another reason why he probably had to put off one of his campaigns against Postumus, was he had to turn back to deal with these Goths and also the city of Byzantium. And he persuaded the garrison to surrender, but then he disarmed them and massacred them, because clearly he'd had enough.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he got
not be tolerated.
Yeah, he got brutal there, but I guess I can see why at this point. But yeah, so I think militarily, he does a hell of a job of surviving. He was loved by his soldiers, which is rare for the period, because when he was eventually assassinated by a cabal of senior officers, for reasons that aren't recorded. Well, again, in that context, he was being militarily successful because he actually, as you mentioned, he defeated the Heruli and the Goths in a battle on the river Nessos, and then he had to return to Italy because his longtime general Aureolus actually turned against him and seized control of Milan, Gallienus's base of operations, and invited Postumus into northern Italy, but Postumus didn't accept the invitation, probably because Postumus understood it was better to be on the defensive when it came to his wars with Gallienus. Rightly so. And Gallienus showed up again defeated Aureolus, just like everyone else he ever came up against generally, and besieged him in Milan. But at that point, his senior officers, for reasons unclear, assassinated him. The one theory is that because so many of them were these Balkan officers, they were upset that the war against the Goths had to be temporarily abandoned. When that happened, though, we're told the soldiers got very upset and that Claudius had to grant an exceptionally generous donative to them, keep them happy, Claudius being, Gallienus' successor. The Senate, meanwhile, because they hated Gallienus for his policies that kind of worked against the Senate, were massacring his supporters in Rome. But then Claudius actually sent them an edict ordering them to stop because it was upsetting the soldiers. But those are the words used. I don't remember which ancient historian says that, but I think it's Aurelius Victor, that it was upsetting the soldiers and so that they should stop massacring his supporters. A different source shows that Claudius, well, we know that he deified Gallienus and also continued building this very large statue of Gallienus in the city of Rome. So clearly Claudius understood that Gallienus was someone who was popular among the army, was popular among the people of Rome, where the statue was being built. Yeah, he was respected. And I guess you can see why. I mean, so yeah, his reforms, you said, we've talked about the cavalry army.
He issued an edict of toleration for the Christians to end Valerian's persecution.
Oh, yeah.
Which,
yes.
It mimics Constantine and Licinius to no end, in that you've had this big persecution to try and get rid of the Christians. And then his solution to the problem is just grant them toleration and let them get on with it and not make an issue of this thing that doesn't have to be an issue.
Yeah, I think he realized how destructive it was being, I guess, because he needed all the support he could get. And
it paid dividends for him in some regards for the Christians, because I remember in Eusebius's account, Gallienus gets a flowing write-up from him. It's like, yes, Gallienus, he was like a mini Constantine, and he granted us toleration, and Christians prayed to him for many years to come, and stuff like that. Not only does it get him brownie points for the Christians, but it also gets rid of unnecessary internal conflict, which he really doesn't need at the moment. And
it's a necessary antidote in the sources to have that, because, as you say, the Senate hates him. That's it. From a historiographical perspective, Gallienus, it's natural that Gallienus became one of the most hated emperors in history. A, because the Senate didn't like him, and the aristocrats are writing the history. B, he was ruling when the empire, not through his fault, just started really fragmenting. And C, actually later emperors, such as the Tetrarchs, use Gallienus's association with Crisis as a kind of byword for their superior leadership. So panegyrics in the Tetrarchic period, one of them does refer to, the orator says something along the lines of, when the empire seemed to be about to collapse during the reign of Gallienus, whether through bad luck or his fault. So the orator sort of doesn't commit to that. But he's using that as sort of a contrast with the restoration of the empire under the Tetrarchs, sort of, erasing everything good that happened in between the Tetrarchic period and Gallienus. But yeah, I think, his reforms, Caelan Davenport, he puts out a theory on why Gallienus wasn't appointing senators as military commanders. And yeah, he thinks that, there's a lot of debate about why he was doing this. I think that clearly a big part of it is career officers make for good generals. But also, Caelan makes the very good point. It's a dark point to consider, but by this point in time, the number of experienced senatorial generals must be low, because there's been serious defeats against the Goths, against the Persians. Legionary fortresses have been captured in Syria and Mesopotamia. A bunch of them have gone over to Postumus's side. So he can't have much trust over the remaining experienced senatorial generals, because all of these previous usurpers have tended to be senatorial. It's only later, with the kind of advent of these soldier emperors, that we start seeing soldier emperor usurpers. Although Postumus is one such example of that. Also, he probably didn't have many experienced men left from the Senate, so he needed to rely on experienced career officers to fill those boots. So it makes a lot of sense, probably. He has this reputation as a bit of an intellectual when we look hard enough for it. It is there, it's hidden under all the vitriol.
Yeah.
But, he was a cultured person. He was initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries in Greece.
Hadrian.
Yeah. So he is a bit of a Hadrianic figure in that sense. He's changing his image as well to be more of a divine emperor, thus the eyes looking up to heaven. Coins start talking about various gods. I think in particular it's Sol, but I think also to a degree Jupiter, as the conservator, the preserver of the emperor, which is paving the way to Aurelian and Diocletian and their use of the gods for their own legitimation. He made very good use of subordinates, because we know of Aureolus being this, until the last year, a trusted general. I mean, Odaenathus. So Odaenathus was clearly a bit of a rogue, but Gallienus, I guess, had the forethought, now was not the time to start a war with Odaenathus. That Odaenathus could be used as a viceroy, as a de facto ruler of the East. As long as Odaenathus continued to recognize Gallienus as the emperor, and he did, that he could
vice versa. So there's no use starting a war with Rome when Persia's breathing down his neck, and everything to gain from remaining loyal to the emperor, but still having all of this power he can wield in the East.
And I think from both of their perspectives, that's a rare example of, really thinking things through, where, Gallienus hasn't set up a family member as this overlord of the East or anything to kind of replace Valerian. It's Odaenathus has sort of taken this role in a way that transcended Gallienus's plans. But Gallienus has the good sense to realize, well, with everything going on, let's not start a war with Odaenathus. Let's use him. And, if it eventually gets to the point where he's too powerful, we can cross that bridge when we have to. And I'll say he made good use of diplomacy as well, because the Franks, there was some prominent Frankish leader who was at that Gallienus allied with as a friend against the more hostile Germans along the Rhine.
Isn't this where the story of his second wife Pippa comes from?
Well, and that's, where he also has an example of him making an alliance with a Marcomannic leader, Attalus. And Attalus's daughter was someone named Pippa, who, the sources frame it as being a second wife to Gallienus. Perhaps she was just more of a consort. But it is providing this window into Gallienus the diplomat as well.
Yeah.
So I'd say he was a great emperor. I think he was just ruling in the worst time to be an emperor.
Well, I almost think that has something to his credit, that despite all of this happening, and a lot of his predecessors, like Decius, had tried and failed to come to grips with the problem, Gallienus tried and succeeded in coming to grips with a lot of the problems of his reign. There were things which were out of his control, or that things would have to get worse in some areas before they got better. So, like, the coinage was debased heavily by him. The Antoninianus dropped from 15% silver in 260 to 2.5% in 268 when he was dead. So the Antoninianus had basically become almost worthless by the end of his reign, and also the copper coinage ceases to exist in terms of mintage. These are all necessary. He has to keep minting coins to pay the army. He's running out of resources. His tax base has been drastically reduced by invasions, posthumous, and rebellions as well. But he's still managing to make it work, and he is effective for the 8 years he has sole rule, and before that, in keeping what's left of the Roman Empire together. I think that his relationship with Odenathus in the East is a good example of that, in that he could have just decided, right, I need to focus all of my attention on this rogue in the East, rather than use him as they both did with each other to their mutual benefit. I don't think he's a great emperor, but he is by far one of the best emperors from this century.
Sure.
And I think he really stands out amongst the Philips and Gordians and so on. So another competent successor of his is Claudius, who he has a very short reign. He's only there for 2 years, but he pretty much puts an end to the worst part of the Gothic invasions, with the Battle of Nasus and the destruction of the Goths. They do continue to attack, but they are finally checked in quite a major way, and it's from that point on that the Romans really start to get a grip on the Balkans and start to push the Goths back over the Danube.
Yes.
His focus on the Balkans pretty much came at the expense of the west, because I believe there's a rebellion in Autun in Gaul, which he doesn't assist at all. Autun just gets demolished by the Gallic troops. But Spain flips back to his control during this time.
Yes.
So the Gallic Empire, although uncontested, is starting to lose a lot of its power and original enthusiasm, almost. Well, Postumus is killed. I think also Odenathus is killed in the east, along with Gallienus. So all the leaders of that era killed off in the same year.
Yeah, in a rough sort of 2-year period or so, yeah.
So that you have a whole new crop of leaders. You've got, well, very quickly you have Laelianus, Marcus, and Domitianus in Gaul, before finally Victorinus becomes Gallic Emperor. And then you've got Zenobia and his son in the east.
Yes,
Vavalathus, yes. In the east, Claudius, what's left of the Roman Empire. So whole new leadership across the board. But he is very successful, and I think just the sheer immediate success of Claudius Gothicus is enough to not only get himself deified when he dies of the plague, so he's one of the few emperors not to be bunked off. When he does die, his brother Quintillus is initially recognized as emperor by the Senate. So there's almost the beginnings of a dynastic link, or at least the thought of it, but it doesn't really happen because of Aurelian. But
yes,
Claudius II, he's there for such a short time, but he's really effective for the time he is there.
Yeah, I do find him hard to assess, because so I can point out things that are do kind of fall short of the mark, but I don't want to be too harsh on him because it is a 2-year reign. But also, on the other hand, this is an emperor who gets a very inflated treatment in the sources because Constantine decides to make him his fictional ancestor. He fabricates this ancestry. The sources keep changing because it was clearly treated in a very vague way, but he was claimed to be somehow related to Constantius, the father of Constantine. And Constantine used this back in later in AD 310, as a way to up his legitimacy, to boost himself opposite his fellow tetrarchs and also Maxentius, whose father was also an emperor. Claudius Gothicus became an incredibly politicized figure in the 4th century, in a way that it's very difficult to get at who the original Claudius was. I mean, his successors, to a degree, his successors do speak for themselves, because like Gallienus, he defeated an Alemannic invasion of Italy. He defeated them at the Battle of Lake Bernacus. That campaign against the Goths, for which he became the first emperor to be called Gothicus, at the Battle of Nasus. Clearly, he was good enough that Constantine's administration saw him as someone to claim as an ancestor. Also, probably because he was only there for 2 years and is a bit of a mysterious figure, it was an easy claim to make. It might be more difficult to make that claim about someone with a longer reign, like Aurelian perhaps, or Probus. That is a bit more of a mystery, and so you could throw that out there and not many people would find problems with it. Not that many people would be trying to do that in front of Constantine. There are some issues. So, for example, the Battle of Nasus against the Goths was clearly a big deal. Yes, it led to the first adoption of the cognomen Gothicus. But interestingly, Ammianus, how he frames this, he seems to frame the wars against the Goths in a way that does transcend that Constantinian lens, where he refers to these nasty raids in the time of Valerian and Gallienus, and then jumps straight ahead to Aurelian, and says that Aurelian ended this threat, and he's presumably referring to Aurelian's victory over the Gothic leader Canabas in 271, and his then invasion of Gothia itself, the Gothic homeland, which also led to the adoption of the title Gothicus. And so it seems that in Ammianus's mind, Aurelian's contribution there was the bigger one. But it's hard to tell. There are some issues, like Zosimus's account points out that after Nisus, the campaign sort of devolved into this more indecisive phase where the cavalry were needing to keep chasing down the Goths, and the Goths the survivors were hiding in the Hymus Mountains. And there's this whole incident where Claudius ordered the infantry to try to block the path of the Goths as they were breaking out of the Hymus Mountains, and he did it for some reason, not explained, without cavalry support. And there was apparently an argument between, the cavalry and infantry officers, with Claudius favouring the infantry officers, at which point the cavalry then had to save the day after the infantry got absolutely pummeled by these seemingly defeated Goths. It'd be Aurelian who's the chief cavalry officer in this event. He's just not named in that moment, but we know from other sources that he was the chief cavalry general. So there was clearly some kind of rivalry between Claudius and the infantry officers on the one hand, and the clearly increasingly formidable and famous cavalry general, Aurelian, on the other. That kind of resulted in this nasty situation where the infantry got badly hit by the Goths. There is also a case to be made, although again, I feel a bit reluctant about saying this because he's only had 2 years anyway. But David Potter, in his book on the later Roman Empire, refers to the year 270 as sort of a sluggish year for Claudius. And I mean, to be fair, that's probably when he's dealing with this more indecisive phase of the Gothic campaign, where he's sort of having to chase them down. But that is also when, as you mentioned, the Gallic Empire is going through problems. Postumus gets himself killed because he refuses to allow the sacking of mines. There's a slew of emperors, and then Victorinus takes control. And while this is happening, Spain defects to Claudius, and Placidianus, a general loyal to Claudius, takes control of Narbonese Gaul, which again is to Claudius's credit that he ordered this guy to, while he was dealing with the Goths, he ordered Placidianus to take control of Narbonese Gaul. So that whole Autun incident happened, where Autun rebelled, clearly thinking that the Gallic Empire was about to collapse, declared allegiance to Claudius, probably because of the Gothic threat. But that's one of the things that David Potter invokes when he calls this a sluggish year. I guess the other controversial thing, but again, it's not really clear how much we should really blame Claudius for it. So, yes, Odenathus is assassinated either in 267 or 268, and there's various accounts of why that happened. Nathaniel Andrade makes a good argument that it was a joint conspiracy between officials at the court of Gallienus and Palmyrings who were fearful of Odenathus's growing power. Peter the Patrician, in particular, refers to an official named Rufinus for being responsible for taking the initiative on this. If the aim of this was to try and end the dynasty of Odenathus, and we're told that his eldest son, Herodian Hiran, was also killed in this incident, if that was the aim, it badly backfired, because his widow Zenobia took control and placed her young son Vabilathus, didn't place him on a throne yet, but made him the correct, the restorer of the East, and so Claudius has to deal with this. That incident may have happened in the last months of Gallienus's reign, but Claudius is having to deal with this issue, and it's a controversial issue when it comes to chronology here, but it seems to be the case that the former Praetorian prefect of Gallienus, Heraclianus, was sent by Claudius to try and restore control of the East. We don't get the details, but his army was defeated in a big way. So I don't think that's necessarily to Claudius's discredit, but it is, I guess, another reason why David Potter views the second year of Claudius's reign as being a much more of a nothing year compared to the first. But I think, again, it's 2 years. People are going to have nothing years. Even the most brilliant emperors are going to have nothing years. And it's not like generally these things are his personal failing. The only one that I think is a personal failing seems to be this whole infantry versus cavalry situation that happened. So I guess somewhere between good and great, I'd put him.
The infantry and cavalry thing might just be the case of the Romans who pretty much use infantry as the majority of their forces for their whole history until this point, with cavalry playing a very peripheral role, still getting used to the idea of making them the primary unit on the battlefield. And even in the late Roman Empire, when cavalry forms a much larger portion of the army, it's still almost much smaller and secondary to the infantry arm of the army. In battles like Adrianople, where the infantry play a big role, and the cavalry try and flank but don't do so well. 6th century with like Justinian, when you have more cavalry-orientated generals like Belisarius, but then you also have more infantry-orientated generals like Narses, who relies heavily on his infantry to win the day. Like Battle of Taginae Bustagalorum, where it's the infantry that win the battle, and then the cavalry are just used to run down King Totila.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I think, that's a fair point, that the growing prominence of the cavalry is a new thing. There would no doubt be elements within the infantry, the infantry formations of Claudius's army who would have a problem with this.
Yeah.
I think under Gallienus is the first time we're seeing coins specifically honoring the cavalry. Like, I think I don't remember what the legends are, but it's something along the lines of, Virtus of the cavalry, the valor of the cavalry, which is showing how important they're getting, probably both, militarily and probably also politically. Thus why someone like Aurelian would eventually become emperor.
And also, having served in Gallienus's cavalry, he knew the importance of that cavalry on the battlefield. And so you see the Dalmatian and Moorish cavalry being significant portions of his army.
Yes.
You've got military changes going on in the background of all this.
I guess it's a rare window then. That event is sort of this interesting window into that tension. We can speculate happened, but I guess this is one of the few windows into that actually being the case then, which is interesting.
Yeah. As much as Gallienus was able to contain the Gothic threat, Claudius symbolizes the beginning of the end of the Gothic threat, which Aurelian eventually deals with. But I think he is a decent emperor. He actually had a legacy beyond just his reign, which is quite interesting.
Yes. Yeah, he clearly made a good enough impression for Constantine.
And also the Senate, because when he dies, the Senate decide to elect his brother Quintillus as emperor. Quintillus's reign can be summed up in that he was chosen emperor by the Senate, then the army rebelled and proclaimed Aurelian emperor, and Quintillus, who didn't have any troops to back him, at the first sign of Aurelian going against him, committed suicide, and that was the end of his reign. The real interesting thing about Quintillus is how long he actually reigned, because there are a few versions of the length of his reign. We have some sources that say he only reigned for 17 days. Another source that says something like he reigned for 170 days, but traditionally he had a very short reign. You can see things that are going on in his reign, in that he's able to have coins minted in places like Siscia and places around the empire which it would take more than just 3 weeks.
Yes.
The emperor recognized as emperor and then start issuing the dies and minting the coins for him, which would be, even with the fastest of messengers, it would take more than just 17 days to start pulling all of this stuff off. So I think maybe number of days has been mixed up somewhere along the way. And maybe it's something like 71 days or 170 days, but something longer than 17.
I know that Alaric Watson's book on Aurelian does conclude that it must be longer than the 17 days.
He's not the only emperor in the 3rd century that gets accused of having an almost singular day reign. In the Gallic Empire, the Emperor Marius is accused of only reigning for a single day between the death of Postumus and Victorinus before being murdered, which again is not strictly true. You have Laelianus, I believe he's proclaimed as rival to Marius.
He's the one actually who Postumus defeats at Mainz.
Domitianus having coins. I think he's the case in that we've only got 2 coins of Domitianus.
I know that some people think that Domitianus might actually be a Narbonese Gallic usurper against Aurelian. That's actually been argued. So it's not entirely clear where Domitianus fits in everything.
Yeah.
But do we have coins of Marius?
Yeah, we do have coins of Marius.
Okay, so that's definitely within a day.
Yeah, that's the thing, is he has to be accepted by the Gallic Senate. They had the institutions of the Roman Empire in the Gallic Empire. It's less of like a centrifugal empire, more like a local copy of the Roman Empire.
Sure.
They're not trying to, let's become Gauls again.
Yes.
You know,
they're not exactly
big statues of Vercingetorix going up. It's just kind of,
they still have
looking after our own affairs and we'll try and sort them out for ourselves.
They've still got consulships. They're still calling their emperors Germanicus. Yeah, as you say, it's this provincial copy of the Central Empire.
Yeah, so Marius, he has a reign of, presumably it was short, even if the sources are wrong. So like the Historia Augusta with the 30 tyrants, they are illustrative of the spirit of what happened. So like, Marius, did he reign for a day? Almost certainly not, but he was there for a very short amount of time.
Yes.
And just like how 30 tyrants, like, were there 30 tyrants? No, but there was a huge number of usurpers and rebellions during Gallienus' reign and beyond.
Yes.
That book is designed to illustrate.
It's also another example of really exaggerating how terrible an Emperor Gallienus was. Let's make an entire book about everyone who usurped against him and exaggerate the number.
Yeah.
Invent usurpers to add to the number.
Just coming back to Quintillus, so he was proclaimed emperor because he was related to Claudius. It didn't really work out, and he committed suicide. So...
Yes, I mean, yeah, he was posted at Aquileia, and he does seem to have had soldiers under him, but the soldiers... I mean, in the Historia Augusta's account, we can take it with a grain of salt, but in the Historia Augusta's account, the army of Aurelian is approaching, and they basically either kill him or just abandon him because they realize, well, what's the point? No, they abandon him, and yeah, that's when he kills himself, yes. That's how the Historia Augusta presents it. But yeah, certainly, I think him unrankable. He did not have a shot.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think he's necessarily incompetent either, because it's just the facts didn't marry up with what was happening on paper.
Yeah, in another time he'd been fine because dynastic succession, fairly normal.
With Valerian, it is starting to work again, especially the army starting to recognize the successors of emperors. It's just Aurelian not only is effective, but also a kind of spiritual successor to Gallienus and Claudius because of his military success, rather than Quintillus, who's a successor by blood.
You know, we're not at a point, things are getting better, but we're not at a point yet in the history of this period where it seems the soldiers are quite ready to just trust in a dynasty at this point. People with demonstrated military talent are higher on the priority list.
Yeah.
I mean, we'll see that again with Florian, where Florian was quickly overthrown by the more established general Probus, whereas Florian was the dynastic successor.
Again, you have this conflict between blood and spiritual succession in that Probus was Aurelian's man. Yeah, I agree. Quintillus is unrankable. Aurelian, in many respects, he ends the crisis of the 3rd century, but it isn't over yet, is how I would describe that briefly. On the surface, you have a Gallic Empire, and you also have a Palmyran Empire, and also the borders are being overwhelmed by Goths, Carpi, and Alamans. All of those are sorted out by the end of Aurelian's over 5-year reign. But his death is almost a sign of the fact that it isn't over yet, and it's not really until Diocletian that the crisis finally comes to an end. I think Aurelian definitely stands out as a great emperor. Not only is he able to come to terms with the military challenges of the empire, but is able to do it so quickly as well. I mean, within 3 years, roughly, he's taken out the Goths, the Carpi, which he settles on Roman soil, the Alemanni, destroys the Palmyran Empire, and also takes out the Gallic Empire through Tetricus's help.
Hmm.
By that point, in sort of the 4th and into the 5th year of his reign, he is starting to sort things out.
Yeah, I think
What do you think of
I mean,
Aurelian, Byron?
I have to go with, I mean, controversial to be, going for this rank when no one has received it yet in our 3rd century one, but I'm going to have to give him an excellent. I think if we had more details, I'd say, on his tactics and strategies, I suspect we wouldn't have trouble mentioning him in the same breath as Caesar and Hannibal and those lots. He was clearly so good at war, this guy.
Yeah.
The amount he gets done in 5 years is really quite incredible. I mean, the amount he has to move back and forth across this empire. His victory over the Euthungian invasion of Italy. The Euthungi twice invade Italy early in his reign, and he defeats both, and his victory in over the second invasion is sufficiently major that it really does, after, we've had Alemannic invasions of Italy under Gallienus and Claudius. After Aurelian, we don't see Italy, unless there's some example I'm just not thinking of right now. Italy isn't invaded by barbarians until Alaric and Radagaisus. Yeah. So he basically ends the problem of invasions of Italy by barbarians. As I mentioned earlier, his victory over the Goths is highlighted by Ammianus as kind of the big one. And certainly invading the Gothic homeland, it's a big move that none of his successors had done, except for Aemilian before he usurped as emperor. And he defeats Canabas, who was killed in battle, and there's an argument to be made that, I mean, it's no way to prove it, but Canabas is plausibly Cniva, a Greek-inspired attempt at making the East Germanic name Cniva more palatable to readers, which we see a fair bit with Germanic names and other non-Roman names. They get Latinized or, Grecified.
Yeah.
So there's a case to be made that Canabas is Cniva, in which case, this person who twice badly defeated Decius in battle and who captured Philippopolis through clever tactics and who repeatedly demonstrated clever tactics managed to get offed by Aurelian. If that's the case, that's a pretty big tick in Aurelian's good column. He defeated the Vandals. That Vandal invasion in winter of 270-271 early in his reign was sufficiently. It was a big enough invasion that Aurelian had to order the cities to take in the cattle and the villages outside. They had to be abandoned and brought into the walls to try and do a scorched earth against the Vandals. And even we're told that Aurelian fought them a couple of times, and the first time it was actually an indecisive battle, which shows that this Vandal group were not pushovers. Likewise, the Euthungi managed to get an ambush on Aurelian, which he incredibly managed to recover from, when other emperors probably would have been butchered by their men after that. So it shows that his enemies, his Gothic, Euthungian, and Vandal enemies, weren't minor, and he managed to defeat all of them in a little over a year's time from his accession in late 270 to the end of 271. He accomplished all of those campaigns, while also dealing with the revolt in Rome.
Yes, the workers' revolt, which
yes,
is a very interesting thing, because I think it's the only time in Roman history that mint workers actually revolt and proclaim, is it Felicissimus?
Yes.
I don't think, is he proclaimed emperor?
I don't think he is, but I think he
leads the revolt, though, I think.
I think actually that's often how it's presented, but I think one source actually says that he was actually, what happened was that because Aurelian was also very anti-corruption. Something about the mint in Rome was, I guess, hoarding the bullion for themselves.
The impression is it was utterly corrupt. They were minting coins without any silver in them.
Yeah.
And
so
when you make a coin, you have the precious metal you put into it, and also an amount of alloy of other metals, so like copper or something else.
Mm.
It's like the sestertius contained zinc as its other metal to give it a bit more value. But they were keeping the silver for themselves and then just bashing out fakes, basically, for the coins. So
Right.
you've got this going. And actually, a major problem during the 3rd century crisis are counterfeits and fake coins, which, coming back to that passage I read out earlier, and that public trust in the coins they're minting disappears. People don't trust these coins anymore because they're either fake, they're either worthless, or some variation thereof. There's also lots of variations in the standard of coins being minted. So, like, one example is during the reign of Gordian. Under his reign, in Antioch, they're minting coins at 43% silver, and in Rome, they're minting coins at 36% silver.
Right.
It's all a bit of a jumble. During this period, which leads to one of Aurelian's main acts during his reign, which are his coinage reform, to try and bring some order to the chaos that was the coinage by this point. Some of the things he tries to do is he tries taking bad coins out of circulation, which is a good idea, because another problem caused by having more and worth less coins is inflation and price rises. So the price of things is going up because there's no confidence in the monetary system, and people are having to try and scramble around for coins which are worth something to pay for anything. Taking out some of the fake coins is a good idea because it helps to improve trust. They are slightly revalued, and they are marked to show the people using them that they have a guarantee of that value.
Of like 5% silver, I think is the 20 to 1, isn't it? I think that's what it. So it went from something like, what was it, 2? Up to 5.
It's doubled in value.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, it's not solving the crisis, but it is trying to mitigate the chaos that has been caused by this.
Yes.
And also there are other things. He increases the grain dole in Rome and also adds pork and wine to the public distribution, as well as grain.
I think maybe oil as well. He was going to introduce an oil dole and a wine dole, and I think maybe his officials dissuaded him from doing one of them.
I don't know what real effect that would have had, but maybe just to foster goodwill amongst the Romans after massacring all of their mint workers.
Yes, well, because that's the thing, like getting back to that mint workers revolt, incredibly, while defending against this Euthungian invasion of Italy, it seems to be around the same time, it might be Eutropius who mentions the specific sequence of events, that he arrests Felicissimus, the treasurer in Rome, and has him summarily executed for corruption. That leads the mint workers to revolt. That leads to major street fighting where Aurelian, after he defeats the Euthungi, has to march on Rome and defeat these rebels. And in the process, he also appears to have used the opportunity to clear the Senate of some of his rivals because, lest we forget, they supported Quintillus.
Yeah.
And Aurelian does have a reputation among the Latin sources, not so much the Greek sources, for being a little bit overly ruthless.
He is accused of being very violent during his...
Yes. And I think it might be Eutropius who kind of says...
I think it is Eutropius.
I think he says that he was ruthless, but we needed someone ruthless. Yeah. But interestingly, the reason why the Greek sources seem to be much more positive about him is because, and again, I think it's a big point in his favor as a military man, is after winning all these wars and securing his control, he then, in 272, invades the Palmyrene Empire. He does this big two-pronged pincer movement with Probus, the future emperor, going into Egypt and then marching up through the Levant, while he marches through Asia Minor into Syria. And he does this consistent policy of clemency, which causes Zenobia to hemorrhage supporters, because he makes this point, and he first makes this point at Tiana, which we mentioned earlier, is where the soldiers wanted to sack Tiana for resisting Aurelian, and there's this whole anecdote where, because he supposedly was so irritated that they hadn't surrendered to him, that he said, "I won't leave a single dog standing." But then he thinks better of it, and he's thinking, well, we can't just have a siege of Antioch and a siege of Emesa and a siege of Apamea and a siege of Palmyra. We need
all of these Roman citizens.
Yeah, and sort of slow them down and make them vulnerable to epidemics and vulnerable to Zenobia's army. And so he adopts this policy of clemency, which he had also made very clement offers to the Vandals and the Ithungi earlier. And the Vandals took the deal and were actually, some of the Vandals were absorbed into his army. But he told the soldiers, ordered that they, he said that they wouldn't be sacking the city. They got very upset, as they did with Saloninus and Posthumus for similar offences. I mean, supposedly his joke was, all right, kill all the dogs. They kind of found this funny and backed off. But I mean, no matter what happened, it seems that Aurelian managed to successfully implement this policy of clemency in a world where that would usually be a death sentence for an emperor, which is quite incredible. His tactics against, I won't go into them in detail, but his cavalry and infantry tactics against Zenobia were pretty impressive. Not only that, he then, at the end of that all, he returned to Thrace to deal with the Carpi, only for Palmyra to rebel again, and this time he showed up so quickly that they couldn't even put up a resistance. He then marched into Egypt to deal with Zenobia's supporters under Firmus, defeated them, took Alexandria, strangled the leader. After all of that, went for the Gallic Empire.
Yeah.
And in one of the most incredible instances in, I think, Roman history, A, because he was probably fearing Aurelian at this point, because this guy was seemingly unstoppable, but also because he did not trust his own army, because the Gallic army was increasingly... I mean, so by this time, Victorinus had been replaced with Tetricus, and then Tetricus had to deal with the usurpation under one Faustinus. He was not trusting his army anyway, and so he basically sent a letter to Aurelian saying he'd willingly surrender to him. And it looks as though, from Aurelius Victor's account, that to achieve this, Aurelian basically dictated that he would lead his army into a vulnerable position and then he could switch sides. So essentially he could then butcher the Gallic army, which he proceeded to do in the Battle of the Catalaunian Fields, which is probably, which we know to be a part of Gaul that would be very favourable to cavalry, which Aurelian excelled in. So he had this great combination of clemency and military know-how that worked really well for him, and just got so much done in such a short space of time. I mean, the last year of his reign after that was still, he had to campaign in Gaul again, because by defeating so many Gallic soldiers that had compromised the Rhine frontier, and so then he had to deal with that, and then so on and so forth, had to deal with, yet another incursion to Thrace, and Rhaetia as well. But so I think from a military perspective, it's hard to fault him. Corruption, he was very anti-corruption, both among the soldiers and among administrators. Inscriptional evidence shows that he built many, many roads, which I guess was going to be very necessary for that level of campaigning.
Oh yeah, that's another thing I'd bring up about his military expertise, is not only is he able to defeat all of these empires so quickly, he is able to maintain the logistics of feeding and moving his army from Italy through the Balkans down into Anatolia and Syria and Egypt and up into Gaul and then down and back again. 5 years, which is impressive.
It
Just
is.
The amount of marching and is very impressive.
He also, and he did expand the mints. I mean, we've established that Valerian was a key part in that. We know that even more mints started being built under Aurelian,
He
which
consolidated a few. So a few that Valerian had set up were closed down. I think it's partially they weren't needed anymore, and moved into more central areas like Siscia.
I think he closed the one in Rome temporarily because of what happened.
Yeah.
And I think he made Milan into his principal mint. There appear to have been a couple built in Thrace that didn't last for very long, but were kind of evidently sort of temporary mints.
Yeah, minting houses to pay his army.
Yeah, so he was clearly putting a lot of effort into that. He opened a mint in Tripolis in Phoenicia. He closed the mint in Trier, but opened one, I guess because of the Gallic regime, but then opened one in Lyon. Yeah, I mean, so we got all that. We've got the grain dole and also the wall of Rome. He built the wall of Rome after the Euthymian invasion.
Which you can still see today, which is...
Yeah. It got added upon by, our later emperors like Maxentius and Honorius, and by early modern rulers as well.
Yeah,
I think to his credit, this is not necessarily, this is a matter of speculation, but it does look like in the last couple of years of his reign, he was starting to think about the succession as well. That's a potential criticism you could levy against him, is that he was a one-man show, it seems. Like he
didn't immediately have a successor like many of his predecessors.
I mean, we know that he had, he did make use of competent subordinates like Probus, and he set up one Marcellinus as the sort of the corrector of the East, and Placidianus in Narbonese Gaul became his praetorian prefect and eventually a consul. So he was using competent figures in important positions, but he didn't set up an imperial college. What we can see is that in 274, his wife, Severina, starts appearing on coins throughout the empire. Every mint except for Tripolis, there are coins being minted for her. And so that suggests to me he's starting to think about dynasty and succession. He probably just didn't have a son yet, or if he did, the son was a baby. And this isn't yet a world where you make a baby an emperor. Constantine was the first to do that, making Constantine the
second emperor 2 years old.
Yeah, that is the first instance of that happening. So, and the last point in his favor, I do have two criticisms, but the last point in his favor, I'd say, is like Gallienus, when he was assassinated. So he was assassinated because his secretary Eros had been doing something corrupt. We don't know what. And fearing Aurelian's wrath, he forged a list of basically, sort of a list of people to be executed or prosecuted by Aurelian. Yeah, as a way to kind of basically to entrap these high-ranking military officers into assassinating the empress to save themselves. But what that did, they then had to flee the camp, and when they realized they had been duped, they supposedly tied Eros to a tree and had him eaten alive by wolves. That's one story. But in any case, they had to flee the camp. The soldiers were blindsided by it. They clearly weren't expecting or anticipating his death, and they deferred to the Senate to choose a successor. Well, after that, Tacitus, the eventual successor, made a point of trying to hunt down these assassins, and Probus continued to do so, and it was Probus who finally killed them. And we're told the soldiers, they mourned the death of Aurelian, and it sort of shows that, like Gallienus, Aurelian was a loved emperor when he died, which again is a rarity for the period. This isn't a military rebellion, this is a court conspiracy.
Yeah.
But I guess the two criticisms I have, and one of them plays directly into that, is he seems to have been overly severe when it came to corruption.
Execution was the lenient one. Well, there's one thing to note about his reign, which is interesting. Eutropius mentions how he's the first emperor to wear gold on his clothes. So golden, rather than just wearing the senatorial toga with the thick purple stripe on it, he's the first emperor to start having a gold stripe. So you start to see this building up of the emperor is more than just a man. And first amongst equals, becoming more the divinely appointed ruler of the world. And also, Lactantius mentions how Aurelian was... It's not very clear because the part about it is partially lost, but it seems like Aurelian was planning persecution of the Christians, which was forestalled by his death, and then not brought up again until Diocletian. But I don't know why. Maybe it's to do with his promotion of the cult of Sol Invictus. But it looks like he was going to reopen a closed chapter during this period, unnecessarily.
An emperor so restoration-minded as him perhaps still thought that maybe he thought that was something Gallienus had done wrong. That maybe in his mind, the reason Gallienus didn't reunify the empire was because the gods were angry with him. And we see that eventually again with Diocletian, that after Diocletian has these big victories over the Persians and Carausius, he then reopens the persecution chapter as well. So, yeah, it's an interesting case of Aurelian and Diocletian on these sort of parallel paths. Yeah, that they're not yet convinced that not persecuting the Christians, they still think it's a good idea. Yeah, the closed stuff is interesting, and it shows that Aurelian, like Gallienus and also Claudius, is on this path of the divine emperor, where he's meant to be the first emperor to wear a diadem, according to the Epitome de Caesaribus. John Malala says that he had a little star in his diadem, and he's the first time the title Dominus starts appearing on coins, just showing that transition into a more autocratic emperorship.
Yeah.
And he also, as you mentioned, he justified his rule through reference to Sol Invictus, which is also increasingly autocratic and quasi-divine. Presumably, he saw some value in this in maintaining military loyalty, because there's an anecdote in the Peter the Patrician. The soldiers were getting upset about something. We don't know the context because it's a fragment, but they were getting upset, and there was a mutiny, and he told them, you're mistaken if you think you can decide who the emperor is. Only God decides who the emperor is. And then he executed a bunch of them. It'd be good to know the context of that earlier in his reign. Just to return to the severity, I think the conspiracy of sending a bunch of names around and that working does sort of suggest to me that people were probably a little too fearful of him, and that might be his fault. That maybe he was a bit too hard on that front. The other issue I'd point to, though, I think it's perhaps not entirely fair to the Roman understanding of the economy is not what it is now.
But the Romans had some understanding, but they didn't quite grasp how inflation worked, or like how to deal with it, and other stuff. It was much more rudimentary than it is today, or even in later centuries, like the early modern period.
Yeah, and I think in this case, that coinage reform that he does in 274 with the 20-to-1 ratio, David Potter and Clifford Ando, they've all kind of pointed out that if you look at prices through the evidence of papyri, it looks as though, and I think a source might say this, that he withdrew coins from the market of earlier emperors and replaced them with these 20-to-1 coins. We can kind of look at that from a modern perspective and realize, well, that is the sort of drastic change that might cause a lot of inflation, because people will lose their confidence in their existing coins. That seems to be reflected in papyri, where hyperinflation ensued from around 274. And so it looks like Aurelian may have inadvertently, through his new shiny 5% as opposed to 2.5% coins, may have inadvertently made the inflation even worse. It looks like he did from the papyri. Again, modern economists can predict that, whereas it's hard to expect Aurelian to do so. That is a notable failing that may have caused a lot of troubles that would persist for future emperors.
It's notable that he has two coinage reforms. He has a small one in
271,
and then the major reform. He has a full kind of basket of policies. After his reign, the coinage, it kind of stabilizes at the floor of its worth. It's not until Diocletian, and it's not really until Constantine the Great, that the monetary crisis really gets resolved. It's an ongoing thing. Virtually every emperor that tries to tackle it fails in some regard.
Yes.
I mean,
to
Aurelian's credit, he does try and tackle it, but I think the problem is he doesn't do enough. And I think Diocletian does the same thing, in that he doesn't remove enough of the bad coins from circulation for his good coins to make enough of an impact, so that you've got, alongside these more valuable coins, you also have all of these crap and fake coins which are also circulating. So you've got an element of confusion and also preference. So people will want to buy and sell things in better coins, but then give out all of the worthless coins they've got. So it's a bit of a palaver, really.
I guess also a factor in all of that is having usurpers, because usurper coins then become of questionable worth. And I think there is a papyrus from Gallienus' reign where I think, from what I remember of it, the official is trying to persuade people it's okay to use Macrianus coins. Actually, and it's because Macrianus is the emperor at the time, but clearly people aren't sure whether to use the Macrianus coins.
Yeah.
Back in Gallienus' time.
It also has the political trap of, if you're using these coins, are you endorsing that emperor even after he's dead? So I think that the fear of bias stars might be floating around as well. Probably not much to happen from it, but again, fear and mistrust and everything, it all impacts the economy in that regard.
Yeah, I think for me, overall, there's no perfect Roman emperor. You know, we can look at things Constantine did wrong and things Justinian did wrong and Augustus did wrong. Likewise, I think Aurelian was a bit severe when it came to corruption. He's probably overly ruthless with the Senate, although he also knew when to use clemency. And it looks like he accidentally caused some hyperinflation, which then stabilized afterwards. But I think overall, he's such an exceptional military emperor, and he also does do a lot in terms of, you know, the representation of emperorship, trying to make it more quasi-divine and imposing. The wall, the grain dole, dealing with corruption. There's so much there, roads and mints as well, that I do have to consider him, obviously not a perfect emperor, but I'd say an excellent emperor.
I think you've convinced me to promote him to being exceptional, because even if you were to take one thing that has survived for Aurelian, which would be his walls around Rome, he left his mark on the world at the time, still today, which none of these other emperors managed to do.
I mean, the very fact of reunifying the empire leaves quite a
impression.
Yeah, it made the jobs of later emperors a lot easier.
We have the curious case of Ulpia Severina. I won't go into the kind of controversy surrounding the whole event. In summary, after Aurelian's death, no one's really sure who's supposed to succeed him, because he hasn't got any blood relatives, and the death is a bit of a shock to everyone. I've just been reminded it's 1:20 in the morning. Everyone's a bit at a loss as to do after Aurelian's death, and there's about a 2-month period where the army, the imperial court, and the Senate work out who is supposed to be the next emperor, and they finally decide that a senator called Tacitus should become emperor, who is quite an old man, but well respected and seems to know what he's doing. But during that time, there's still this element of confusion about who's supposed to be emperor. And Ulpia Severina, for people not in the centre, is seen as that person to put on the coin. There are a few mints in the east, such as at Antioch, where Ulpia Severina, on the coin legend, she's given the same titles as a actual emperor would, rather than just empress.
Right.
I think more out of confusion and people not really knowing what to do now. So they've heard Aurelian's dead, but don't know who's supposed to replace him, and someone has to go on the coin. So the next best thing is Ulpia Severina. But I think we should definitely refrain from suddenly calling her the first Empress Regnant, because she's not known to have passed any acts. None of the literary sources mention her as ruling in any way, which they most certainly would have done.
Yes.
So she is an emperor on paper, if not in fact.
Yeah, I mean, because we know she's an Augusta, and she had been an Augusta since 274. But that various women in the 3rd century did did receive that title.
Hmm.
But yeah, he appears on these coins. Aurelian is no longer present, indicating that he is dead by then. Yeah, that seems to be minters, coiners not knowing what to do, just going with the next available person while awaiting the new emperor's announcement, because that was being debated by the Senate, because the soldiers deferred to the Senate. So it's an unusual situation where I guess you can see why a numismatic curiosity like this would happen. But because they couldn't exactly keep minting for Aurelian, because
He's dead.
Yeah, when an emperor is dead, he ceases appearing on coins, or if he does appear on coins, it's in a deified capacity. Yeah, I don't think she counts. Yeah.
So I think you'll agree with me in putting her in unrankable.
Yes, I would.
Next, we have Tacitus, who is not related to the historian, although I'm sure he would have liked to have been. A fairly elderly senator who seems to have known what he was doing. His reign is very short. He goes to Anatolia because there's a Gothic attack there, and he defeats the Goths. Then he captures a fever and dies. That's pretty much his reign in a nutshell. Other than that, he appoints Florian, his brother.
His half-brother. Yeah, makes him his Praetorian prefect.
Yeah.
There's another version of events where Zosimus says that he was killed, and the reason he gives is Tacitus had made a cousin of his, Maximinus, I think the governor of Syria, maybe, somewhere in the east. Maximinus was apparently very corrupt, and so a bunch of discontented aristocrats or notables, they collaborated with some of the assassins of Aurelian who were being hunted by Tacitus, and together they killed him and then got out of there. That's another version of his death. He did win, yes, that Gothic victory, and so he becomes the third emperor to be called Gothicus after Claudius and Aurelian. And he seems to have been well respected, although that might be in part because he's the choice of the Senate, and so notorial authors like Aurelius Victor are going to be very pro him compared to all the soldier emperors of the period. He apparently had some military experience, and I guess that shows in his victory over the Goths. But yeah, Tacitus, it's hard for me to say that he's any more than mediocre or okay.
Yeah, I would agree. I think he's mediocre. He seems to have acquitted himself well, but that's it. And then we have Florian, his half-brother, who, again, you have the situation with Claudius II's death, in that his relative is proclaimed emperor, but also you have the military proclaiming another emperor. They proclaim Probus, so you have a civil war between Florian and Probus, but there's no actual fighting involved, in that Probus is already in the east, and Florian is near the east, and his reign pretty much consists of him marching to meet Probus, but Probus retreats into rough terrain, which is poorly supplied, and Florian's troops get sick to death of this phony war and decide to murder him and join Probus. And that's pretty much it.
He also, in the process, Zosimus tells us that he failed to finish off the Goths by committing to this war with Probus. I should probably specify that, yes, these Goths had been raiding Asia Minor, and these Goths, the Balkans seems to be pretty much secure from the Goths ever since Aurelian's reign. But we know that Aurelian was in Thrace when he was killed, and some sources say that he was killed while fighting a campaign against the Goths. Probably that is the beginning of what we're seeing here, these Gothic raids into Asia Minor now. I mean, Asia Minor had been suffering raids since Valerian's reign, but it was still happening. The northern coastline of Asia Minor was clearly having a bad time, and had been having a bad time for a long time. And Aurelian is assassinated during the campaigning around the Black Sea. And then Tacitus wins his victory, and then Florian, rather than finish off these Goths, allows them to escape inadvertently while he marches east to deal with Probus. That said, this is the last instance we hear of, I'm pretty sure, of Goths raiding Asia Minor. Maybe there's hints of it in Probus's reign, but sort of ceases to be a major thing.
Effective enough to take the wind out of their sails, that even though Florian...
Yes.
finish them
Yeah,
off. They were still defeated.
Yes, and I certainly wouldn't give the credit for that to Florian, definitely. It looks like Tacitus may have won the last major. I know Probus does take the title Gothicus, so there appears to be some incident that is poorly recorded a bit later, but yes. But Florian failed to finish off these Goths and then marched to Probus, and we're also interestingly told that his army, because it was essentially an army of soldiers from the Balkans, they really did not do well in the Syrian weather during this, waiting for a battle with Probus. Yeah. And there was a bunch of skirmishes and nothing was happening. So yeah, that was one of the reasons they were really having a bad time of it. But yeah, I mean, I guess he's a poor emperor. He doesn't really do anything that's praiseworthy.
Definitely incompetent. Other than because Probus was already experienced in fighting in the East, and Florian seems to have not to have been. And he played straight into Probus's hands. I mean, the Goths is a question of priorities, I think. You could say that by not using the opportunity to get a victory and solidify some kudos with the troops, that he missed a trick there. And so they may have been a bit more loyal to him when he went to turn against Probus.
Yes.
But at the same time, you could say if he managed to defeat Probus, then the Goths wouldn't have been a problem.
That's true, and I wouldn't want to put too much emphasis on him not finishing them off, because certainly this whole period is about emperors needing to prioritize different risks, and Gallienus had to do it, and Aurelian had to do it. I merely bring it up because it is one of the very few things we can actually say about Florian. But yes, he looks to have been incompetent.
Move on to Probus, who I think is a great emperor. He follows in the footsteps of Aurelian in many ways. He defeats several usurpers in the west. I imagine they pop up because there is all of this concentration on the eastern frontiers, that at this point it's just a lack of an imperial presence is enough to inspire the creation of one in the provinces. Well, I think it's Sebastianus. Saloninus, who rebels, and I think he has to take out 3 different usurpers during his reign.
Yes, because there's also on the Rhine Proculus and Bonosus.
They're all major threats that he has to deal with, and he does so successfully. But also, he tries to tackle with the problem of how does he use his army, which is always on the move, to try and rebuild the ruins of the Roman Empire. And I think his solution is actually pretty clever, in that he uses the army to plant vineyards and also local civic projects, so that as the army is moving around, they're not only defeating rebels and barbarians, but also restoring the lands that have been devastated. He also settles a defeated tribe of Franks in northern Italy. There's lots of land that, because of all of this turmoil for such a long period, there's lots of farmland which has just been abandoned and neglected and become overgrown. Aurelian does it, and Probus starts settling Roman citizens and also defeated barbarian tribes on Roman soil to put these farms back into production. So you see a lot of consolidation, and he's starting to lay the foundations for the empire's recovery during his reign, which seems to have been fairly effective. He was successful enough to have a 6-year reign, and it was only because he managed to get on the wrong side of his Praetorian prefect Carus that he was murdered. Before he was killed, he was planning an expedition to the east to take out the Persians, kind of deal a punitive strike just like Aurelian did to the Goths. You're progressively seeing the fight being taken away from Roman soil and onto enemy soil. I think Probus is a very successful emperor. It's just a shame he wasn't able to carry on.
I agree. He's a great emperor. And he may even be more than great if we knew more about him, but he happens to be, even by 3rd century standards, Probus's reign is a murky, we're in murky waters with it. The sources are so vague on chronology, on details.
I think also scholarship's a bit shadowy on Probus as well, because a lot of the attention gets drafted towards Diocletian or Aurelian or Gallienus.
Yes.
Probus has less kind of successors that really shout out to people. Like Aurelian has his conquest, Diocletian has the late Roman Empire being set up, and Gallienus has the world ending, and then Probus's most notable acts is getting his soldiers to plant vineyards.
He kind of does occupy a more awkward space in that narrative, I guess. Yeah.
I know he's had a biography written about him from the 1940s, 1950s.
There is a book from, I think, 2003 by Kreuscher, but it's in German. That is the only recent work on him, and I think a big part of it is the source details are really not good. Well, certainly what the ancient authors say about him suggests a great emperor, because I think I was talking about how if we had more details, we could probably talk about Aurelian in the same breath as Hannibal. I think it's Aurelius Victor who explicitly compares Probus to Hannibal. He refers to him as a Hannibal-like general. Eutropius compares him to Aurelian and says he was like Aurelian, but not as bloodthirsty. The Historia Augusta absolutely loves Probus. his biography of Probus is sort of cringeworthy to read because it's a bunch of praise without any details.
Yeah.
But clearly either he loved the emperor or he's doing a bit. You can never really tell with Historia Augusta, but it does seem noteworthy. I know there is a theory that he may have had the Probus family of late 4th century as patrons, who weren't actually, I don't think they were considered related to Probus. I know they weren't, but actually no, they weren't, because they're an Italian senatorial family, but the namesake element may have been getting exploited there.
Like
but in any case, yes, exactly. But clearly he was very good. Early in his reign, as I mentioned before, he prioritized the hunt for Aurelian's assassins, and he notably, he red weddinged them. He invited a bunch of them to a banquet and then killed them. Well, so this might tell the lie to Eros being eaten alive by wolves, because they claim that one of the people wasn't killed on the spot, but was actually burnt alive by Probus, and maybe that's actually what happened to Eros, the original ringleader. But in any case, he killed the assassins. He won great victories over the Burgundians, the Lugi, the Vandals, the Franks, the Bastani. We have various, not great details provided, but various descriptions of how he won those victories in Zosimus. In one case, he made a point of attacking, I don't remember which of those groups he was attacking, but he attacked them while they were separated there were two groups, and he attacked them while they were separated by a river, which is a clever thing to do. I think in another case, there was a particularly large group of barbarians, and so he whittled them down with harassment warfare and then dealt the death blow. So we know he was really good at warfare. He was very peripatetic, he was always on the move, much like Aurelian. He also had successful subordinates that he made good use of. His subordinates we know to have dealt with various problems, including there were the Blemiers of the eastern desert of Egypt and the Sudan, were raiding Upper Egypt, and we know that in association with, I think, one of the cities of Upper Egypt was in rebellion as well. I think it was Coptos. So one of his subordinates dealt successfully with that, and that's the sort of rebellion that seems minor, but it's actually kind of important because
Egypt is very important. The one province the empire always tries to makes it its top priority.
Upper Egypt in particular Coptos is actually on the node of roads that leads to the ports along the Red Sea. And so you lose Coptos, it affects your access to the Red Sea trade and your access to Indian goods and East African goods and all the money that comes from port dues through that trade network, as well as the mines actually to the east of those Upper Egyptian cities, like where you get red porphyry and granite and gold. So it also affects those economic interests. And so we know one of his subordinates dealt successfully with that. There was a piracy, not a piracy situation. Oh yeah, there was a Frankish piracy situation, but actually what I was thinking of was, yes, in Azuria. And one of his subordinates had to deal with that and successfully defeated the brigand.
Bandits.
Yeah, the leader was called. I think this might be the earliest mention of it.
Because that's a very long-term issue for the Empire, the Isaurian brigands. well, until the 5th century with Zeno.
Yeah, I think this might be an early example of that problem starting to become a thing. At this time, Probus doesn't personally deal with it, but he sends someone to besiege Lydas, the leader, and his men in the town of Cremna, and it's this whole nasty siege where Lydas and his men actually, because they're running out of food, push the inhabitants off the walls and all these kind of nasty things, and eventually Lydas is taken out by catapult, sniped him. But yeah, that's one of the few events in Probus's reign where we have more details. Really, he dealt with the usurpers. I think he personally dealt with Proculus and Bonosus on the Rhine.
Yes.
One of them fled into barbarian territory, maybe. Some indication that he did that, but Probus had allies among the barbarians who got rid of him.
Yeah.
It's a good use of diplomacy. Saturninus, I think, was killed by his own men before they came to blows. I think he didn't have to personally get rid of him.
Turned up and they decided it was a bad idea in the end.
Yes. And actually, there is also an anonymous usurper in Britain in this period. I think Zonorus mentions him. And maybe Zosimus as well, where Probus sent a subordinate. Again, he clearly, despite being a very peripatetic emperor, just always on the move, he did actually make good use of subordinates as well, and sent someone to get rid of this either usurper or usurper planning to be a usurper, either a conspiratorial usurper in Britain, perhaps a loyalist to Proculus or Bonosus, perhaps. And yeah, the reconstruction efforts are certainly an important thing to, very impressive. Something that we forgot to mention with Aurelian was that, Aurelian, because Dacia had been at half strength since the time of Gallienus, and Aurelian needing to draw soldiers from the Danube frontier so that he could actually fight Zenobia, he made the decision to just, withdraw from Dacia, and he withdrew the administrators and the remaining soldiers, and also a lot of the people. And one of the reasons is because Aurelian was resettling these people. He decided Dacia was a lost cause and he needed the troops, but he decided to resettle these people in Moesia and Thrace, these devastated Balkan provinces, and have them basically restore the land that had been devastated by Goths and Vandals and so forth. And so Probus is sort of following in that tradition with, as you say, he's following in this tradition of, we're needing to find ways to restore the land, whether it's through settling barbarians or resettling provincials. And
keeping the army busy. That's the other thing, that by keeping the army planting vines and so on, they can't revolt as easily because they're all so busy and their minds are on other things rather than grumbling about who's in charge and so on.
True, although, and that's that theory, Hannibal famously employed that tactic. Although in Probus's case, the Latin sources do say that they finally did have enough of it, that they were building something near Sirmium in Pannonia. And we know that Pannonia, this would make sense for the reconstruction perspective, because Pannonia was absolutely devastated since the time of Gallienus. And we know that Probus had used his soldiers to, plant vineyards and to, I think he drained a lake near Sirmium. There was something like that. There was some kind of irrigation plan. They didn't like being used for things other than war. What exactly happened with Probus's death? The Latin sources attribute it to that, whereas the Greek sources point out, Carus had usurped, and he was over in Rhaetia and Noricum, the Praetorian prefect, and also governing those territories, and or administering the troops in those territories. And Peter the Patrician says that Probus marched out with his troops to deal with Carus, but then his troops turned against him. The degree to which those versions of events sort of merge together is a little bit on the clumsy side. The Latin authors do think that for all the good intentions of the reconstruction efforts, maybe they actually unintentionally soured the soldiers against him. I don't know. I guess there's no way of telling how fair an assessment that is necessarily. One assessment of Probus that I've seen from Clifford Ando is that his reign was unusually rebellion-prone even for the 3rd century, and Clifford Ando thinks that that's a failing of Probus. I don't know how fair that is, because we don't really know enough about him. Yes, and certainly, again, the ancient authors viewed him very highly. My only other criticism, I guess I would suggest, is we get no indication of what he was planning for the succession. There's no indication of an empress or a son. And again, I guess 6 years isn't a very long time. But I suppose it is a long time for the context of the 3rd century.
The 3rd century, 6 years is...
So maybe he should have had someone in waiting. But overall, I think it's hard to say that Probus wasn't great.
I would agree. His failures are... well,
they're secondary.
Secondary and hard to pin down, really. So Carus. Carus is quite interesting, being a Gaul in origin rather than Illyrian, like many of these people.
Yes, from Narbonese Gaul, I think.
His reign is very short. He ruled from 282 to 283, and reign consisted of leading a successful campaign against the Sassanids and actually succeeded in sacking Ctesiphon.
Yes.
At which point, one night, his tent gets struck by lightning, or someone threw a torch into his tent and he burned to death. But quite successful. His victory against the Sassanids removes them as a threat for a good decade until the ambitious King of Kings Narse becomes king and goes up against the Tetrarchs, but that's much later, 290s. So basically his campaign neutralizes the Sassanids as a threat to the east. So I'm inclined to put him in as a decent emperor. I think that achievement alone is worthy of note. And to do it so swiftly. I mean, he reigned for a year, and yet he was able to take out the Sassanid capital.
I think I view him as a decent or good emperor. I think, unlike Aurelian and Probus and Claudius, he's immediately thinking about the succession when he takes over. I think because he is an elderly man when he takes over anyway.
Yeah. Carinus is co-Augustus in the west, and Numerian as Caesar. So it's a similar setup to Decius and also Valerian. He has someone as co-Augustus in another part of the empire, so a replacement for himself. So there is a kind of division of labor and also a succession.
Yeah, he's definitely following in the footsteps of Valerian. Carinus is given the west, and he's going to take on Persians in the east, and Numerian is going to follow him as the Caesar. It does bear a strong resemblance to what Valerian does with Gallienus. What's more, it's a dynastic college, much like Valerian as well, with adult sons. So Carinus is definitely an adult. And Numerian, I mean, we don't really, it's hard to tell, but he seems to have been at least maybe on the cusp of adulthood. I don't think we're really told.
I get the impression he is a young man.
Yeah, that's sort of the vibe I get reading the accounts of him. And also Carus almost immediately earns some military credentials for himself by fighting the Sarmatians. We're not given any details, but he won a victory over the Sarmatians very early in his reign, and then decided to pick up where Probus left off because, yes, as you mentioned, Probus was planning to make a move against the Persians, and so then Carus adopts this plan and follows through with it. Carus does have an advantage in this sense, and Probus would have had the same advantage, and that is that, and probably this is one of the reasons why Probus was planning on doing it when he was doing it. So the Persian king of kings at the time, Bahram II, did have in the east a number of, a bit of it was internally an unstable reign. He had a cousin, Hormizd, who appears to have rebelled in Sarkistan. And there was also the client king of the Kushans, also named Hormizd, who appears to have also rebelled around this time. The two Hormizds seem to be allies.
Yeah.
And we are told that Carus invaded when Bahram was dealing with these threats in the east. So, and I think that's probably might go back to Probus, that Probus was thinking, well, this is the time to strike, a bit like Times Atheus and Gordian attacking Shapur's empire around the time when Shapur was having to deal with rebellions. Carus is able to march on Ctesiphon and take it, seemingly while Bahram is unable to do much about it. But it's still an impressive achievement. I mean, to capture the city of Ctesiphon couldn't have been an easy thing, you would imagine.
No.
And he's the first person to pull it off since, I think Lucius Verus might have done it. Maybe Severus. I'm not sure. Did Severus take Ctesiphon? The second century emperors seem to have been able to do this, whereas third century emperors generally couldn't, but Carus is the exception.
And 4th century emperors tried and failed as well.
Yes, but I think overall, formed a good dynastic college. He had strong wars against the Sarmatians and the Persians. He achieved something against the Persians that previous emperors hadn't done, against the Sassanid Persians, that is. And that, as you say, had an effect, because when Diocletian eventually takes control, we're not told the details really, but we know that Bahram was, within only a couple years or so, made an alliance with Diocletian, and clearly he was not feeling like he was in any capacity to fight the Romans.
The strong King of Kings, Narses, that the Sassanids actually decide to go on the offensive against the Romans again. Now the political situation had kind of settled for a bit. And actually after he's defeated by Galerius, you have another series of internal instability and civil war. So,
yes, there's indications that the Kushans and those eastern satraps again become disloyal and rebellious after Narses is defeated. Yeah, I think Carus, I think he's a good emperor, or a decent emperor. Like Valerian, he does also deify his late wife. I've forgotten her name, but he does this, again, thinking about dynastic self-presentation. He does, he's doing well on that front.
Yeah.
Then he just gets, dies in strange circumstances. I know there's one article that suggests that, makes the point that a thunderstorm during that time of year in Lower Mesopotamia seems unlikely, but I don't know enough about the weather patterns of the Middle East to really comment on that. But he's sort of the opinion that he was assassinated. A decent, very short reign.
I almost prefer the struck by lightning version. It's just so bizarre and funny.
I think I prefer that too. I hope that's what happened.
Yeah. It also seems strange that Carus would die, and then Numerian left alive.
Yeah, it would have to have been something very covert, wouldn't it? There couldn't have been a rebellion or anything. Maybe it really was thunder.
Speaking of Numerian, I think he's unrankable, because from what I know of his reign consists of marching back to Nicomedia, and then being discovered that he's been dead for several weeks.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. The only thing down is he extracted the army from Persia, but it's not like they were defeated, so it's not that much of an achievement. He had to be unrankable.
Just covered the logistical challenge of getting his army out of Mesopotamia, which could be difficult, as Julian the Apostate found out.
Yeah, we're not really told that it was a particularly difficult withdrawal, so yeah, I'm inclined to be unrankable.
Yeah.
Which leaves Carinus.
Yeah. I know he gets a rather negative write-up in the sources. He's displayed as a violent, lazy, drunkard or such, a bit of a womanizer as well, and wastes his time in the west. Carus was away in the east fighting the Persians. Diocletian propaganda campaign is probably to do with that, but he seems to have been successful in that you don't hear of any usurpers or anything like that. The only issue is Diocletian is proclaimed emperor by the army after Numerian's found dead, and then Carinus marches to meet him, and then at the Battle of the Margus, it's a bit hit and miss who's actually winning until part of Carinus' army defects, his Praetorian prefect betrays him, and he is murdered, ending the civil conflict. But I don't know, it's difficult. It's like, maybe he wasn't enough to inspire confidence in his army, but at the same time it could have just been opportunism by his Praetorian prefect. So
his relationship with Valerian is kind of this, with Carus, it's this microcosm of Gallienus and Valerian in a way, because he's the emperor left to deal with all the other issues in the empire, while his father heads east and then dies in unfortunate circumstances. Yeah, it is very difficult to get a real grasp of Carinus, because Diocletianic propaganda is making a big effort against him. And that's going to be adopted by subsequent emperors, because the Constantinians derive, come out of that tetrarchic regime, and then the Constantinian regime is there for a very long time. And so that's a long time for Carinus to be established, for it to be established as fact that Carinus was an absolute tyrant. Yeah. So he's very unfairly vilified, it seems. And we can, at the very least, so we don't have many details, we can see from his laws that he's moving back and forth between Gaul and Britain and Italy. So he's certainly active. And we know that he took the cognomina Germanicus and Britannicus. So he was fighting campaigns, and he seems to have been in Gaul actually when his brother died. Because, I mean, it looks like there's a bit of debate about whether these were two usurpers or one usurper, but when Carus died, apparently there was the governor of Dalmatia, Aurelius Julianus, usurped, and Carinus had to defeat him. Then a different Julianus, a Sabinus Julianus, the Praetorian prefect, when he heard that Numerian had died and Diocletian had taken over in the east, he also decided to usurp, and he usurped in northern Italy. Carinus marched south and defeated Sabinus Julianus at Verona, the same place where Philip was defeated by Decius, because I guess it was such a strategically important node along the roads. Likewise, Maxentius and Constantine, Maxentius' army and Constantine would fight at that location. And then he marched east to deal with Diocletian, who by that time had received the support of Egypt and was entering the Balkans himself. And yes, they fought on the Margus. So up to that point, Carinus seems to have defeated various Germans and maybe Picts and one or two usurpers, depending on whether there's one or two usurpers named Julianus. But yes, there's actually an indication, as you say, in the sources that he appears to have been doing, there's vague references to him doing reasonably well against Diocletian until his army deserted him. That sort of spelled the end. He was deserted by part of his army, and I mean the sources give variant details, but a convincing reconstruction I saw was that part of the army rebelled at the Margus, and then he fled to the west to a fortress, to a little Danube fort called Cornacum, which was where he was then cut down by one of his tribunes. And we know from Aurelius Victor that, as you say, his new Praetorian prefect, after Sabinus Julianus had rebelled against him, he appointed a new Praetorian prefect, Aristobulus, who was then retained in his command by Diocletian for, to quote Aurelius Victor, the services he had rendered. So it sounds like he betrayed Carinus as well. And actually, Constantius, the father of Constantine, may have been involved in all of this, because he named his eldest son to Maximian's stepdaughter Theodora. So he had his son Constantine, but then he had a bunch of sons to Theodora. And the eldest of those sons was named Dalmatius, and we know he was the governor of Dalmatia at the time. And in the Balkans, that would be, a useful place to show your loyalty to Diocletian during a Balkan campaign between Diocletian and Carinus.
Yeah.
So it sounds like a whole lot of people betrayed poor Carinus. And probably that doesn't necessarily, maybe, I don't think there's any shame in being an inferior politician to Diocletian, because Diocletian, as we'll get to, is pretty politician. Exactly. And so the fact that he could defeat you by causing you to just hemorrhage all your supporters isn't necessarily a reflection on the badness of Carinus, but just how good Diocletian is at politics. Interestingly, a very recent article that came out just this year, the scholar Brian Rose argues that the Arch of Constantine in Rome, the frieze depicting the Battle of the Milvian Bridge on that arch, he argues, fairly persuasively, is actually a depiction of the Battle of the Margus. And it was reused by the people making that arch for Constantine. There might actually be this prominent depiction of this otherwise little-known battle on the Arch of Constantine in the middle of Rome. Because I guess it would have been Diocletian's Actium, or his Milvian Bridge. It would have been an important battle for him. But yeah, I think Carinus I regard as a decent emperor.
I'm just wondering about why so many people wanted to betray Carinus. I mean, it is the third century,
Hmm.
so it's not exactly surprising, but I do wonder if, although he was apparently effective in the West, if his personality didn't quite match up to his abilities.
Hmm.
Because, I mean, okay, you do have the Diocletianic propaganda, but typically use things that were already there, exacerbate them. Maybe things like having his school bullies executed and stuff like that is maybe a grain of truth to it. I don't know. I mean, it could be Diocletianic propaganda, but at the same time, why would he point out these things rather than just doing the usual? He was lazy, slept around, and stuff like that. Maybe just speculating, but
Yeah, I think I suppose it depends on the source because I know a lot of these claims are the Historia Augusta,
mm,
and that's just such a bizarre source that it's very difficult to know what to
yeah.
use within it.
I think
But
it's also
I may.
Eutropius, and it may be a Kaisergeschichte.
All right, well, so then maybe there is some element of truth because I know that the claim given, for example, for why the tribune killed him was that he was sleeping with the tribune's wife, and so
Yeah.
maybe that's true as well. Although then again, being rapacious with women is a trope of tyrants in the Roman world.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to. I guess that's a fair point though that if Diocletian is able to cause such a slew of defections
Mm.
that doesn't it doesn't reflect well on Carinus certainly.
I think if you also, again, it is kind of just based on speculation, but if you flip it the other way, Diocletian is the usurper. Why was he
Mm,
able to succeed where Saturninus or Japatian and people like that failed in their usurpations against the
sure.
clearly legitimate Emperor Carinus?
Yes, sure. Um, no, it's a fair point, and I think probably the answer, probably the answer lies somewhere between. There were probably issues with Carinus,
Mm.
and also Diocletian was a step up from the likes of Jatapianus in terms of just being posing a formidable threat. That clearly he was just good at politics,
Yeah,
in a way that many of these usurpers
why not?
were, I guess, average to not. Yeah. Maybe mediocre is better because I think he did clearly. I mean, he was capable of defeating usurpers and Germans.
I will err on the side of caution and put him in mediocre. But again, I think the trouble is we know so little, which is kind of verifiably fact about him, that it's really difficult to tell either way.
So I suppose if he won some victory over the Franks or the Alemanni that was in some way comparable to the victories of Probus or Aurelian, I guess one of the issues is Diocletianic sources would
Suppress it. Yeah.
yeah, that no one trying to receive imperial patronage during those 21 years of Diocletian's rule or the years afterwards
Mm.
are going to bring that up. But
Yeah.
I guess that does mean that we don't have a lot to work with. Yes,
Right.
I
So
agree.
that is the third century emperors before Diocletian. Next time we'll talk about the first tetrarchy. I hope you've enjoyed listening to our talk about all of the emperors. I'd like to thank you, Dr. Byron, for coming on.
Yes, no, it's been a lot of fun.
And this has been Eastern Roman History.